What if the origins of marriage weren't soft veils, sacred vows, and candlelit rituals, but blood-soaked sheets, public inspections, and bodies offered like currency? What if the foundations of love in the ancient world weren't tender at all, only transactions wrapped in ceremony? Behind the bridal garlands, beneath the incense and hymns, lingered practices so perverse you'd swear they were myths. They aren't. Law codes record them. Stones say them out loud. Court journals whisper them. Archaeology preserves what priests tried to scrub clean. The official story claims ancient marriages were sacred unions of families and gods. The truth? Quiet systems of domination. Ritualized, normalized, celebrated. Some customs survived centuries. Some were outlawed, then resurrected. Some were buried so fast, historians had to pry them out of clay tablets and papyri. These aren't rumors. These are documented. Chroniclers wrote them. Priests officiated them. Kings enforced them. Tonight we dig beneath the garlands and the gold to unearth 30 of the most perverted ancient marriage customs history tried to scrub clean. This isn't scandal. It's a pattern. This isn't isolated. It's systemic. Welcome to 30 most perverted ancient marriage customs that will shock you. A descent into the hidden, the forbidden, the carefully buried corners of human history. If you're into unsettling truths and the dark side of ancient civilizations, subscribe. No fluff. Only documented darkness. No speculation dressed as history. No myths presented as facts. Just archaeological evidence, translated texts, legal codes, and historical records that most history classes conveniently skip. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney, a sleepless 2 a.m. in Chicago, dawn breaking over Delhi, late night in Lagos. Perfect. This is a late night video, the kind of history that makes more sense when the world is quiet, when your defenses are down, when you're ready to confront what textbooks sanitize. Because here's what they don't teach you in school. Marriage, that institution we're told is about love and partnership and choosing your person. That's new. Historically speaking, extraordinarily new. For most of human civilization, for thousands of years across every continent, marriage was something else entirely. Marriage. We think we know what it means: union, love, partnership, choice. Commitment between two people who selected each other. Romance leading to lifelong partnership. Voluntary association of equals. The ancients had different words for it. Property, control, lineage, transaction, alliance, commodity exchange, bloodline management. Women as resources to be allocated by male authority according to family and state interest. And it wasn't just one culture doing one disturbing thing. It was systemic. It was global. It was normal. The practices we're about to document aren't aberrations. They're the baseline, from which modern marriage slowly, painfully, partially evolved. They're what marriage meant for most people in most places for most of history. So, before we dive in, understand, this isn't about shocking you for entertainment, though you will be shocked. This is about confronting the actual history of an institution we've romanticized beyond recognition. This is about asking what happened, how it happened, who it happened to, and why we forgot. We start where marriage wasn't chosen. It was purchased and inspected. Dust hangs in the air. A timber platform rises in the center of the square, rough-hewn and stained from years of use. Bronze coins clink in leather pouches. Men gather in clusters, fathers with calculating eyes, sons counting their inheritance, merchants assessing another type of merchandise. This isn't a marketplace for grain or livestock. It's a bride auction, and it happens every year. Around 500 BCE in ancient Babylon, in the shadow of the ziggurats where priests claimed to commune with gods, marriage began not with courtship, but with commerce. The annual bride market wasn't hidden in shame. It was public spectacle, community event, essential social machinery. Herodotus, the Greek historian often called the father of history, documented what he witnessed, or what informants told him, about these auctions in his Histories, Book 1. He describes a system both pragmatic and perverse, efficient and dehumanizing. The process was methodical. Once a year, all marriageable women, virgins of appropriate age, daughters ready to transfer from father's house to husband's, were gathered in one place. Imagine them standing there, row upon row, some in fine linen dyed with expensive purple, others in simple wool. Some had been prepared for this day since birth, fattened on dates and honey, their skin oiled and perfumed. Others stood with slumped shoulders, already knowing their fate. An auctioneer, typically a respected community elder or official, presented them one by one. He started with those deemed most beautiful by community standards, the ones with clear skin, symmetrical features, full figures suggesting fertility, connections to wealthy or powerful families. The bidding would begin. Men called out prices. The bids escalated. Fathers sweated, hoping their daughters would fetch high prices that enhanced family prestige. The women stood silent, turning slowly so bidders could assess them from all angles, their eyes trained downward, their futures being determined by the weight of silver-changing hands. The highest bidder won her hand, paid his price to her father, and the transaction was complete. A document was drawn up, cuneiform pressed into wet clay, recording the sale. Witnesses marked it with their seals. The woman was led away to prepare for a wedding to a man she'd just met, whose only qualification was having more silver than the others. But here's where it gets darker, much darker. The money collected from auctioning the desirable brides didn't line the auctioneer's pockets. It became dowry payments for the women no one wanted. This was the system's perverse genius. Beauty subsidized plainness. Desirability funded obligation. The less attractive, the disabled, the ones without powerful families, the ones with facial scars or bent backs or stuttering speech, they stood at the end of the line. After all the pretty ones had been sold, these women were presented, and men were paid to take them. The auctioneer would announce, "Who will marry this woman for 50 shekels?" If no one accepted, the price rose. "Who will take her for 60 shekels?" The money came from the fund built by selling the beautiful women. Men bid on how much they required to accept the burden of an undesirable wife. Imagine standing there, hearing men negotiate the price of your unworthiness, hearing the sum rise higher and higher because you're so undesirable that accepting you requires larger and larger compensation. Eventually, someone accepts, not because they chose you, not even because they were attracted by money, but because the sum finally exceeded their revulsion. Herodotus claims this system ensured every woman found a husband, framing it almost as social welfare. He presents it as remarkably fair. No woman left unmarried, wealth redistributed, market forces solving social problems. The reality? Women were commodities with price tags, positive or negative. The perfumed oil in their hair, the reed ink tallies recording their value, the way bidders assess them like livestock at market, checking teeth and complexion and bearing. This wasn't partnership. This was purchase. Modern scholars debate the accuracy and prevalence of Herodotus's account. Some argue he exaggerated or conflated different customs from different cities. Others suggest he misunderstood what he heard, his Greek presumptions filtering Babylonian practices through distorting cultural lens. Economic tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period show complex marriage contracts involving bride price and dowry, but don't explicitly confirm public auctions of this scale or regularity. But here's what we know for certain. Neo-Babylonian marriage contracts were commercial documents. They specified property transfers, obligations, and penalties for breach. They listed the bride's value in economic terms. They treated marriage as business transaction, requiring documentation like any major purchase. Whether the auction itself happened exactly as Herodotus described or not, the principle stands: marriage as economic transaction, women as transferable assets, value determined by male consensus and community standards. The bride had no voice in the bidding, no choice in the buyer, no agency in determining her future. Her father received compensation, or paid compensation, depending on where she fell in the hierarchy of desirability. The transaction complete, documented in clay, sealed by witnesses, she left with a stranger, a man who'd purchased her like he'd purchase a field or a slave, who'd assessed her like livestock, who'd never asked her name. And she went to his house, became his wife, bore his children, served his household. Her entire existence determined by how attractive community consensus deemed her, by market forces, by the weight of metal on scales. Not every bride was sold, some were tested. Torchlight flickers against stone walls. The marriage bed, carved oak, linen sheets woven by the bride's mother, is dragged toward the window, not for air, for witnesses. A crowd gathers below in the courtyard. They're waiting. They're expecting proof. Europe, medieval period, roughly 1500 CE. The wedding ceremony ends with bells and prayers. The priest has blessed the union. The feast has been consumed. Roasted meat, bread, wine flowing. Musicians have played. Families have celebrated the alliance. Now the couple retires to the bridal chamber. But the night isn't private. It's evidence collection. It's performance. It's trial. The proof of virginity ritual transformed the most intimate human act into public spectacle, legal document, and social referendum. After consummation, after the bride's first sexual experience in pain and fear and pressure, the blood-stained sheet was displayed, sometimes from a window for the crowd below, sometimes carried through streets in procession, sometimes presented to family elders or church officials for formal inspection and certification. The stain proved the bride's purity. No stain, scandal, dispute, potential annulment, social destruction. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't exaggeration. Manorial court records across France, England, Spain, and Germanic territories document actual legal cases hinging on that stained linen. The records are precise, bureaucratic, and chilling. A groom could demand the return of bride price if the sheet showed no blood. The marriage could be dissolved. The bride could be sent back to her father's house in disgrace. A failed commodity, damaged goods, a liar about her virginity. Families could face social ruin, particularly among nobility and wealthy merchant classes where marriages represented alliances and property transfers worth fortunes. Women could be returned to their fathers in shame, or worse. In some documented cases, brides found to be non-virgins faced physical punishment. In the most extreme cases, recorded in local chronicles and church court proceedings, they were publicly whipped, branded, or even killed by their own families to restore honor. Canon law commentaries from the period discuss the sheet inspection as normal practice, particularly among nobility and merchant classes where property transfers accompanied marriage. The church's position was complicated, officially disapproving of such carnal focus while simultaneously acknowledging its role in maintaining social order and property rights. Cardinals debated, theologians wrote treatises. Some argued the practice was vulgar and against Christian modesty. Others defended it as necessary protection for grooms against fraud. Regional chronicles record elaborate variations. In some areas of southern France, the sheet was blessed by a priest first, holy water sprinkled on it before the consummation, then examined after, as if divine sanction made the scrutiny more acceptable. In others, elder women from both families conducted the inspection together, mediating disputes. They were considered expert witnesses, able to distinguish genuine virgin blood from forgery. In the most intrusive versions, documented in castle records and noble household accounts, witnesses remained nearby during consummation, standing outside the door, listening, sometimes entering immediately after to verify timing and authenticity. The bride and groom performed their most intimate act, knowing ears pressed to the door, knowing inspection would follow within minutes. Some regions required the sheet to be preserved as legal document. It was stored in family archives, marked with dates and seals, available for inspection if the marriage's legitimacy was ever questioned. If the couple's children later inherited property or titles, opponents might demand to see the sheet, to verify the marriage had been legitimate, the bride truly virgin, the children undeniably legitimate heirs. The human cost was calculated differently by men and women. For the groom, his honor rested on his bride's intact hymen. His masculinity was proved by taking her virginity. His family's investment was protected by physical evidence that they'd received what they'd paid for. An unused woman, property undamaged by previous owner. For the bride, her entire future, her safety, her family's reputation, her children's legitimacy, her right to remain in the marriage, depended on blood appearing on coarse linen, under pressure, in a moment of pain and fear and performance anxiety, with iron hooks holding the fabric taut outside the bridal chamber, and church bells still ringing from the ceremony. The medical ignorance that undergirded this custom compounded its cruelty. Not all virgins bleed during first intercourse. Modern gynecology confirms this. Hymens vary enormously in thickness, elasticity, and coverage. Physical activity, horseback riding, strenuous work, athletic pursuits, can tear hymens before any sexual contact. Health conditions affect tissue fragility. Natural anatomical variation means some women are born with minimal hymens requiring little force to penetrate. None of this mattered. The sheet must show red. If it didn't, the bride was labeled liar, whore, damaged goods. Her protestations of innocence were dismissed. Her tears were evidence of guilt. Medical reality was irrelevant to legal and social consensus. No blood equals no virginity equals fraud. Some families prepared for this, knowing the system's injustice. Secret vials of chicken blood hidden in the bride's garments. Pricked fingers at the crucial moment. Small cuts, strategically placed, hidden until need arose. Mothers passed these desperate techniques to daughters, teaching survival in a system that demanded evidence the body might not provide. The custom persisted into the early modern period in some regions. Records from the 17th and even 18th centuries document sheet inspections, though increasingly concentrated among conservative rural communities and traditional noble families. Remnants survive today in certain traditional communities, though increasingly condemned by international human rights standards and women's rights advocates who call it exactly what it is: invasive, degrading, based on medical ignorance and female subordination. But medieval Europe didn't invent invasive marital customs. They'd inherited and adapted traditions from earlier cultures. Sparta had been perfecting them for centuries before Christ was born. Night in ancient Sparta, around 400 BCE. A door forced open, not violently, but deliberately. This is expected, sanctioned, ritual. The entire community knows it's happening. The state has approved it. The elders have overseen the matching. The bride waits. She knows what's coming. She's been prepared for this since childhood, training alongside girls who will face the same ritual. In a society obsessed with military discipline and state control, even marriage is warfare by another name. Her hair is cut, not trimmed delicately, shorn to stubble, masculine style, the way a young Spartan soldier's hair is cut before his first campaign. The barber is rough, efficient, removing her femininity in swift strokes. Her wedding dress is taken. She's given men's clothing instead, a rough wool cloak, a tunic that hangs wrong on her female frame, sandals sized for larger feet. She lies on a hard pallet in darkness, dressed as a man, waiting for her groom to come like a thief. Then he comes. Her husband, a man she may have never properly met, though they've likely glimpsed each other during communal exercises and festivals. He's been chosen by families and state officials for genetic compatibility and social alliance. He enters her room like a thief, like an intruder, like a soldier taking what Sparta has assigned him. He takes her in silence. No words of love, no romantic gesture, just duty performed in darkness. Then he leaves before dawn, returning to his barracks, to his military unit, to the only family that truly matters in Sparta, his brotherhood of soldiers. This is marriage, Spartan style, and it's only the beginning of years of strange, disciplined, state-controlled courtship. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Lycurgus centuries later, documented this bizarre ritual as standard practice in Sparta's unique social system. He drew from earlier sources that have since been lost, preserving descriptions of Spartan customs that would otherwise have vanished. The bride kidnapping wasn't spontaneous violence or individual pathology. It was choreographed ceremony, mediated by elders, embedded in a culture obsessed with military discipline, demographic control, and the subordination of every personal relationship to state interest. The shaved head served multiple purposes, according to Plutarch and other ancient commentators. It masculinized the bride, supposedly making the transition less jarring for young men accustomed exclusively to the company of other soldiers. From age 7, Spartan boys lived in military barracks, training, eating, sleeping together. They formed intense bonds with other males. Sexual and romantic relationships between young men and their mentors were common, even encouraged as building unit cohesion. When these men reached marriage age, typically around 30, they'd spent 2 decades in homosocial military culture. The solution? Make the bride look like what they were accustomed to. Shave her head. Dress her as a man. create visual continuity between the masculine world of the barracks and this strange new obligation called marriage. The ritual also symbolized the shedding of her former identity. She was no longer a daughter. She was no longer a maiden. She was married property, transformed, no longer belonging to herself. The shaving marked her as taken, transformed, socially dead to her old life, and reborn into service. But here's the strangest part. Stranger than the kidnapping, stranger than the shaved head. After this ritualized first sexual encounter, the husband returned to the barracks. He remained primarily with his military unit, visiting his wife only in secret at night, sometimes for years before they established a proper household. Spartan society prioritized the soldier over the husband, the state over the family, the military unit over the married couple. Young married couples in Sparta often couldn't recognize each other in daylight. Think about that. They'd coupled repeatedly in darkness, produced children, but never had a normal conversation in full light, never shared a meal, never appeared together in public as a married unit. The husband would sneak away from barracks at night, itself a test of military cunning, visit his wife briefly, then return before dawn. If caught, he'd face mockery from his unit, the olive oil scent of the gymnasium, the leather and iron of military gear, the sweat and close quarters of the barracks. These were more familiar to Spartan men than their wives' voices. They could identify their fellow soldiers by footfall and breathing. But their wives, strangers they used for reproduction. Plutarch presents this as producing stronger marriages, claiming the forbidden nature of visits increased passion and fertility. He argues that the difficulty of access made the eventual reunions more intense. The Spartans themselves apparently believed this system created deeper bonds than constant cohabitation, though one suspects this was justification for military convenience rather than actual relational wisdom. Modern analysis sees it differently. Systematic subordination of personal bonds to state control, women treated as breeding stock, managed by a government obsessed with producing soldiers, intimacy itself weaponized for demographic engineering. Every aspect of Spartan marriage served military ends. Eugenics ensured healthy warrior sons, delayed cohabitation, kept soldiers in barracks during their peak fighting years, and the ritualized nature of marital contact prevented emotional bonds from competing with unit loyalty. The ritual kidnapping reinforced Spartan values at every step. Discipline, bride submits, groom follows protocol. Obedience, both parties accept state-arranged marriage without protest. Sacrifice of personal desire for communal good. No one asks if the couple is compatible, if they'll be happy, if they want each other. Romance is weakness. Choice is chaos. The state decides breeding. The state controls access. Marriage is duty performed in darkness, fear buried under cultural discipline that treats dissent as treason. If women weren't seized in Sparta, in the cold north, they were priced with mathematical precision. Smoke fills the longhouse. Seal-fat lamps sputter. Iron scales sit on the table between two men, the bride's father and the groom. They're not discussing love, compatibility, or happiness. They're negotiating weight in hack silver. Medieval Scandinavia, roughly 800 to 1200 CE, operated marriage as explicit economic transaction, recorded in elaborate legal codes. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, and similar Norwegian and Swedish legal texts treat wives as valuable property requiring proper compensation, transfer documentation, and liability coverage. The bride price, or munder, was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family. This wasn't a gift. It was purchase compensation for the transfer of a productive asset. A woman's labor, reproductive capacity, domestic skills, and family alliance. The amount varied based on the woman's status, family connections, and perceived value to the household economy. But the transaction cut both ways. The bride's family also provided a dowry, property or wealth, that technically remained the wife's but was managed by her husband. If the marriage ended, complex calculations determine what portion returned to which family. Here's where it gets mathematically perverse. Medieval Norse law applied Weregild logic to marriage. Weregild was the compensation paid for killing someone, a price on human life calibrated to social status. The same accounting principles governed marriage dissolution. A wife was worth specific amounts depending on circumstances of separation. Did the husband die? The widow received a portion of his estate, calculated based on bride price paid and years married. Did the wife die in childbirth? Her family might receive compensation. Divorce? Intricate formulas divided property, with blame assignment affecting distribution. Adultery? Breach of contract with penalties. Domestic violence. Depends on severity and witness testimony, with some level considered acceptable discipline. The sagas, written records of family histories and legal disputes, read like accounting ledgers with occasional violence. Njál's saga spends pages detailing the financial arrangements of marriages, divorces, and the compensation owed when things went wrong. Human relationships reduced to knotted cords and hack silver on scales. Women weren't passive in this system. High-status women could negotiate, own property, and initiate divorce, but always within economic frameworks that treated them as assets. A woman's testimony in legal disputes about her marriage was worth less than a man's. Her freedom of movement was restricted. Her exit from bad marriages was costly, complicated, and male-controlled through fathers, brothers, or adult sons. The longhouse smoke, the weight of silver changing hands, the carved oaths sealed with witness marks. This was marriage in the medieval North. Alliance and honor, yes, but also double-entry bookkeeping with beating hearts. Some unions weren't alliances at all. Some were childhoods erased before they'd begun. Copal smoke rises thick and sacred. The incense clings to embroidered cloth, a miniature huipil, perfectly woven, sized for a child's body. She wears it now. She is perhaps 12, perhaps younger, old enough for blood, old enough for marriage. Welcome to the Aztec marriage system, documented extensively in the Codex Mendoza and Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex. Compiled in the mid-1500s from indigenous informants shortly after Spanish conquest. While some details reflect post-conquest Christian influence, the core practices align across multiple independent sources. Aztec girls married young, often at the onset of puberty or shortly before, typically between ages 12 and 15. Boys married slightly older, around 20. This wasn't unusual for the historical period globally, but the Aztec system combined youth with immediate, intensive obligations that transformed children into laborers and ritual participants overnight. Marriage negotiations were complex social affairs involving matchmakers, family consultations, and astrological calculations to determine auspicious dates. But once arranged, the transition was absolute. The young bride left her family home permanently, entering her husband's household, often an extended family compound, where she became the lowest status adult, subservient to mother-in-law and senior wives in polygamous arrangements common among nobility. Her work began immediately. Domestic labor was endless and skilled, grinding corn for hours daily on metat stones, weaving textiles that constituted significant family wealth, managing complex food preparation, maintaining household shrines. Young bodies performed adult work without transition or training period. But labor was only part of the burden. Aztec society was intensely religious, and women bore specific ritual obligations. Bloodletting was central to Aztec worship, offering one's own blood to the gods. Married women participated in these rituals, piercing tongues, ears, or other body parts with maguey thorns to provide blood for sacred baskets. The pain was worship. The scars were piety. Sahagun's informants describe the wedding ceremony itself: ritual bathing, symbolic binding of the couple's garments, 4 days of seclusion, prayers to Tlazolteotl, goddess of filth, sexuality, and purification, offerings of blood. Child brides underwent these rites. Understanding fertility was their primary value, pregnancy expected quickly. Childbirth without effective pain management or medical intervention, maternal mortality staggeringly high. The Codex Mendoza includes detailed illustrations of child rearing and household management, showing girls trained from early childhood in the skills they'd need as wives. The preparation was practical because the transition was immediate. One day a daughter in her father's house, the next day a wife grinding corn in a kitchen thick with chilly steam, serving her husband and his parents, her childhood finished. There was no concept of too young in a culture where life expectancy was short and child mortality high. but the Florentine Codex records indigenous prayers asking gods to protect young brides from the dangers of early pregnancy and childbirth, suggesting the Aztecs themselves recognized the risks, even as the system remained unchanged. And this was just the beginning. The funeral pyre crackles. The scent of sandalwood and ghee mingles with smoke that rises thick into the Indian sky. Conch shells sound in ritual sequence. A red veil covers her face, the widow now expected to join her husband's corpse in the flames. She's dressed in her wedding finery, as if going to a ceremony. In a sense, she is. This is the ultimate completion of her marriage vows. Sati, the practice of widow immolation on her husband's funeral pyre, represents marriage ideology extended past death, transformed from earthly contract into cosmic obligation. The term comes from Satyas, meaning virtuous woman, derived from the goddess Sati, who self-immolated in Hindu mythology after her father insulted her husband, the god Shiva. But religious justification masked a complex social practice with regional variations, historical fluctuations, and considerable controversy even within Indian society across different periods. The practice existed in certain regions and communities, particularly among upper castes in parts of northern India, from around the Gupta period, 4th–6th centuries CE, through the Mughal era and into British colonial rule, but prevalence varied enormously. Some regions never practiced it. Some periods saw decline, others resurgence. Temple inscriptions and stone memorials called Sati stones, carved monuments marking locations where the practice occurred, provide archaeological evidence scattered across the Indian landscape, silent testaments to thousands of women who burned. These Sati stones often include carved images, a woman's raised arm, sometimes holding objects, accompanied by inscriptions dating the event and naming the deceased. They cluster in certain regions, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, parts of Uttar Pradesh, suggesting concentrated practice in areas with particular social and religious configurations. Some Sati stones became objects of veneration, with local populations treating the immolated women as saints, bringing offerings and prayers. Mughal chronicles offer varied perspectives reflecting the complex Muslim responses to a Hindu practice. Some emperors attempted restrictions. Akbar, 1542–1605, the Mughal emperor known for religious tolerance and administrative reform, reportedly tried to limit the practice, requiring official permission and ensuring the widow's choice was voluntary, a telling requirement suggesting coercion was common enough to require explicit regulatory attention. His court chronicler Abul Fazl documented cases and reforms in the Akbarnama, describing the emperor personally intervening in some instances to prevent sati. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Local rulers and regional authorities often looked away, particularly when powerful families were involved. The practice persisted despite imperial ambivalence. Later, Mughal rulers showed less consistency in policy. Some ignored it, some tacitly condoned it, some actively opposed it. The empire was too vast, the religious landscape too complex for uniform policy. The mechanics were horrifying. The widow, often drugged with opium or bhang to dull resistance and pain, was dressed in her finest wedding garments and jewelry. Sometimes she was carried to the pyre in procession, crowds following, drums beating, religious songs filling the air. The atmosphere was part funeral, part festival, part sacrifice. In some documented accounts, she walked willingly, believing she'd join her husband in paradise, that her act generated immense spiritual merit, not just for herself, but for her family line. Religious authorities promised her 70 million years of bliss for herself and her husband if she completed the act. Poetry celebrated her courage, songs praised her devotion. Social pressure was immense. In others, relatives physically placed her on the burning corpse, bound her with ropes, or surrounded the pyre with bamboo poles, using them to push her back into the flames when she tried to escape. The crowds chanting, the drums, the conch shells, all worked to drown out screams. European observers who witnessed sati in the 18th and 19th centuries described the horrifying sounds, the attempts at escape, the relatives preventing rescue. British colonial records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries provide statistics that prompted reform movements. William Bentinck, Governor-General of India, pushed for abolition after collecting data on prevalence and circumstances. Company officials documented cases, interviewed participants, and compiled reports that shocked British audiences and reformers in India. The Bengal Sati Regulation of 1829, pushed through by Bentinck with support from Indian reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy, officially banned the practice in British-controlled territories. The regulation cites evidence of the practice being in many cases accompanied with force or fraud, and declares it illegal and punishable as culpable homicide. The debate was fierce. Conservative Hindu voices argued sati was ancient tradition, religiously sanctified, voluntary act of supreme virtue. They accused British authorities of cultural imperialism, attacking Hindu religion under guise of reform. Indian reformers countered that sati wasn't universally Hindu, wasn't practiced in many regions and periods, and that religious justifications were corrupted traditions used to mask economic motives, families avoiding supporting widows by eliminating them, because that's what widowhood meant in communities practicing sati: social death. Widows faced shaved heads, white saris forever, restricted diet, often forbidden meat, certain vegetables, even pleasant foods, social exclusion, loss of property rights, subordination to in-laws, sometimes virtual imprisonment. Many Hindu widows weren't allowed to remarry. They were considered inauspicious, their presence at festivals and celebrations unwelcome. They became dependents, burdens, living ghosts. The pyre simply made literal what society had already decreed. Better to die spectacularly, generate religious merit, be memorialized in stone, than live decades in slow degradation. Here's an impossible statistic that reveals the scale. In 1817-1818, East India Company records documented 839 sati cases in Bengal alone. In just 2 years, in one region, under colonial observation attempting to count them. How many went unrecorded? How many in periods and places without documentation? How many in the centuries before British record-keeping? The numbers are staggering and ultimately unknowable. But prohibition didn't equal elimination. The practice continued in some areas, sometimes secretly. Families who burned widows faced prosecution, but enforcement varied by region and official commitment. Some communities moved to areas beyond British control. Others conducted sati covertly, claiming later the widow died of natural causes. Even today, despite being illegal throughout India since 1947 and specifically criminalized by the Commission of Sati Prevention Act of 1987, isolated cases still occur, though now prosecuted as murder. The most famous recent case, Roop Kanwar in 1987, an 18-year-old widow in Rajasthan who burned on her husband's pyre. The case sparked national outrage, leading to the 1987 Act's passage. Investigations revealed whether she was willing or coerced remained disputed, with family claiming voluntary religious act and critics citing evidence of drugs and force. The ideology underlying sati reveals marriage as a permanent bond transcending death. A virtuous wife couldn't outlive her husband because she wasn't an independent being. She was his extension, his property, his eternal companion, incomplete without him. Her identity was absorbed into his so completely that his death necessitated hers. The practice claimed thousands across centuries. Temple stones stand as memorials. Some communities venerated them, treating immolated women as holy. The glorification made the practice self-perpetuating. Die on the pyre, become sacred, survive your husband, face lifelong shame and deprivation. Marriage didn't end at death in this logic. It conquered death. Death became proof of ultimate wifely devotion. And death wasn't the only limit. Sometimes marriage didn't even require a living bride. Night, a burial site in rural China. Red silk cords, the color of luck and marriage, connect two grave markers. Paper money burns. Offerings of fruit and incense sit before tablets inscribed with names. One dead man, one woman, living or dead, depending on the arrangement. This is ghost marriage, and it's not ancient mythology. It's documented practice spanning millennia. Ming Hun, or ghost marriage, appears in Chinese records from the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, through the Qing Dynasty, 1644-1912, and beyond. The practice continued into the 20th and even 21st centuries in some rural areas, occasionally surfacing in criminal cases that shock modern sensibilities. The logic is spiritual and practical. Traditional Chinese cosmology held that unmarried dead people, especially men, became restless ghosts, potentially bringing misfortune to living relatives. Marriage secured the deceased's position in the afterlife ancestor hierarchy and maintained family lineage even posthumously. A son who died unmarried couldn't have descendants, breaking the family tree. Solution: marry him to a deceased woman, allowing symbolic offspring through adoption or spiritual conception. Ancient tomb contracts provide evidence. Archaeological excavations have uncovered marriage contracts buried with remains, formal documents uniting two dead people in matrimonial bonds. These weren't private family rituals hidden from authority. They were legally recognized arrangements with proper documentation. Variations existed. Sometimes a living woman married a dead man, usually arranging for her eventual burial in his family tomb. More commonly, families arranged marriages between two deceased individuals, negotiating bride price and dowries as if both lived, then conducting marriage ceremonies at grave sites. The darker version involved a deceased man and a living bride. The woman underwent a full marriage ceremony, dressed in wedding red, carried to the groom's family home, bowed to his ancestral tablet, then lived as a widow, serving his parents until her death ensured proper burial with her ghost husband. Some volunteered, believing the security of family care worth the loss of normal marriage. Others were sold by desperately poor families. Historical records from the Ming and Qing dynasties document ghost marriages among both common people and nobility. Fees were negotiated. Matchmakers specialized in finding compatible ghost couples, consulting fortune tellers and ancestral requirements. Wealthy families paid substantial bride prices for appropriate matches for their dead sons. Status mattered even in death. The practice became criminal when it required fresh bodies. In 2007, Chinese police uncovered a ring killing young women to sell their corpses for ghost marriages, a modern horror emerging from ancient custom. The case revealed that black market prices for female corpses could reach tens of thousands of yuan, creating monetary incentive for murder. The men convicted in that case were executed, but the demand that created the market reflected persistent belief in ghost marriage necessity. Anthropological studies in the 1940s, 1960s documented ghost marriages as still common in rural areas. Folklorists recorded the songs sung at ghost weddings, the specific rituals required, the community's role in witnessing and legitimizing the union of spirits. The custom reveals marriage as a system extending beyond life, beyond love, beyond human relationship, into cosmological ordering. The living served the dead through matrimonial arrangements. Women's bodies, living or dead, remained exchangeable commodities in a market that transcended mortality. Where spirits claimed brides in China, law codes claimed bodies throughout the ancient Near East. Clay. Cool, permanent, precise. The tablet sits in the British Museum now, but it was written around 1076 BCE in the Middle Assyrian Empire. Its cuneiform script, pressed by scribes who recorded law as divine command. Tablet A of the Middle Assyrian laws addresses marriage, sex, and women's bodies with bureaucratic precision. What it reveals is a legal system that codified female subordination so completely that the concept of marital consent became meaningless. The laws are specific. A married woman belongs to her husband in ways both comprehensive and chilling. The text explicitly addresses a husband's sexual rights. He may do as he pleases with his wife. No restrictions, no conditions, no consent required. The law doesn't discuss this as potential abuse requiring regulation. It's framed as natural order. Penalties for sexual violations illustrate the ownership logic. If a man rapes an unmarried virgin, he pays compensation to her father and must marry her. She becomes property damaged and then purchased. If a man has intercourse with another man's wife, the penalty isn't for the woman's violation, but for trespassing on another man's property. The injured party is the husband, not the wife. The punishment for convicted adultery by a wife, death or mutilation, at the husband's discretion. He could choose to kill her, disfigure her, or forgive her, entirely his decision. If he chose forgiveness, her lover was also forgiven. maintaining symmetry of male authority over consequences. But male adultery carried different calculus. A married man faced no penalty for sex with unmarried women, slaves, or prostitutes. The law only intervened if he violated another man's property rights by sleeping with another man's wife. Marriage created asymmetric ownership. Wives were bound absolutely. Husbands were bound only to respect other men's claims. Middle Assyrian law, number 23, is particularly telling about women's bodies as property. If a woman brings about the loss of her husband's inheritance through miscarriage or infanticide, she faces impalement on stakes. Her body was a vessel for producing heirs. Failure in that function warranted death by one of the period's cruelest execution methods. The laws also regulated clothing. Respectable married women and daughters of free men must veil in public. Slaves and prostitutes must not veil. The veil marked property status. Covered women belonged to men of status. Uncovered women were available or servile. A slave woman who veiled faced flogging and having her ears cut off. The law policed boundaries of ownership through fabric and violence. Modern translations of these law codes, available through multiple scholarly sources and museum collections, present them matter-of-factly. This is what justice meant in 1076 BCE. The Middle Assyrian laws weren't aberrations or the work of a particularly cruel king. They were baseline legal expectations, written and preserved because they represented societal consensus. For centuries, these clay tablets sat buried. When archaeologists excavated them in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they revealed legal systems where marriage meant comprehensive male authority backed by state violence. Women were property who could be beaten, mutilated, or killed based on their owner's judgment. This was law, not lawlessness. This was order, not chaos. Rome would inherit this legal logic and perfect it. The atrium echoes with footsteps on mosaic floors. Wax tablets sit on a marble table. Contracts, property records, family registries. A father, the paterfamilias, absolute head of household, prepares to transfer an asset. That asset wears a wedding veil. That asset is his daughter. In ancient Rome, from the Republic through the Empire, roughly 509 BCE to 476 CE, marriage was embedded in a legal framework of absolute paternal power called patria potestas. The paterfamilias, male head of household, held legal authority over all family members, children, wife, slaves, freedmen, grandchildren born into his household. His power was near total, theoretically including life and death, certainly including control over property, marriage, and legal status. This wasn't just tradition, it was codified law, preserved in legal texts that influenced European legal systems for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. A daughter never escaped male authority. Never. She transferred from father's potestas to husband's manus, literally hand or control, through specific marriage forms. The marriage itself was a property transfer, documented as carefully as any real estate transaction, with witnesses and formal procedures. She was inventory being relocated from one balance sheet to another. 3 classical forms of marriage transferred manus to the husband, though these evolved over Rome's long history. Confarreatio was an elaborate religious ceremony involving sacred cake, panis phareos, priests, and specific rituals binding the wife to her husband's family and religious cult. This was the most formal, most aristocratic form, required for certain priestly families. It was nearly impossible to dissolve. Coemptio was ritual sale, a symbolic purchase of the bride involving bronze and scales, echoing the way one might buy a slave or a field. A witness held scales. Coins were weighed. Formal words transferred the woman from father's possession to husband's. The ritual made explicit what other forms obscured. This was economic transaction. Usus was acquisition through cohabitation. Living together for a full year gave the husband manus over his wife, like adverse possession of property, unless she left for 3 consecutive nights each year, breaking the continuity of possession. Yes, Roman marriage law borrowed directly from property law. Gaius's Institutes, a legal textbook from around 161 CE that became foundational to Roman law, explains the system with clinical precision. Under manus marriage, a wife was loco filiae, in the position of a daughter to her husband. Think about that legal fiction. She wasn't a partner, she was a daughter, a subordinate, a dependent, a minor under guardianship. She couldn't own property independently. Any property she brought to the marriage or inherited during it became her husband's. Her labor belonged to him. Any income she generated was his. Her children were his exclusively. If the marriage dissolved, the children remained with the father, and the mother had no legal claim. They were her husband's property, born from his property, her. The alternative, marriage sine manu, without hand, kept the wife under her father's potestas even after marriage, but gave her slightly more flexibility. She could inherit from her natal family and potentially retain some property control, though still under her father's ultimate authority. But this freedom was relative. She'd simply remained her father's property rather than becoming her husband's. She still couldn't make independent legal decisions, couldn't represent herself in court, couldn't control her own life. A daughter's marriage served family strategy, alliance building between powerful families, wealth consolidation through combining estates, political connections that could advance family interests in Senate or imperial court. Elite families arranged marriages in childhood, sometimes betrothing infants to secure alliances decades before consummation. The girl had no voice. Paterfamilias decided whom she'd marry, when, and under what terms. Her consent was legally unnecessary until later imperial reforms made token consultation nominally required, though fathers could still override objections. The dowry system reveals the cold economic calculus underlying these arrangements. A father provided dowry to the husband, transferring wealth with the daughter, typically land, money, slaves, or valuable goods, constituting a significant portion of the father's wealth. This wasn't a gift to her. Legally, it belonged to her husband during marriage, though might revert to her family if the marriage ended, depending on complex legal provisions. The size of dowry affected marriage prospects directly and brutally. Undowered daughters from poor families remained unmarried or married down in status, their lack of wealth making them undesirable. Wealthy daughters were valuable alliance tools, married and remarried multiple times as family political needs shifted. A woman might be married at 12, widowed at 20, remarried at 21, divorced at 25, remarried again at 26. Each time serving family strategy, her preference is irrelevant. Divorce was possible, but initiated primarily by men and serving male interests. A husband could repudiate a wife for adultery, defined asymmetrically. His affairs with unmarried women didn't count, but also for wine drinking, seen as precursor to sexual immorality, key-making, implying she'd steal from his household, or essentially any reason if he was willing to face social consequences among his peer group. A wife could leave a marriage, but face social stigma and severe property complications. If she'd brought a large dowry, she might have leverage to recover it. If not, she returned to her father's household with nothing, or faced survival as a social outcast. The historical evolution of these rules reflected broader changes in Roman society. Early Republic marriage was dominated by manus forms that completely subordinated wives. By the late Republican Empire, sine manu marriages became more common, giving women marginal increases in property control. Elite women in the imperial period could sometimes wield significant informal power through control of wealth, though always mediated through male relatives or the fictions of legal guardianship. The Roman legal framework influenced European legal systems for centuries through reception of Roman law in the medieval period. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, preserved these property-based marriage laws. European legal scholars rediscovered these texts in the medieval period and incorporated Roman principles into local legal systems. Patria potestas echoed through European law into the modern period, fathers controlling daughters' marriages, husbands controlling wives' property, women as legal minors requiring male guardians. Think of it as corporate mergers with beating hearts, assets assessed, contracts negotiated, transfers documented, future yields calculated. How many sons might she produce? How will this alliance benefit family interests? What property comes with the package? The difference? These assets wore gold jewelry, walked in wedding processions, and delivered heirs in pain and blood. Some dynasties decided to keep those assets in-house, literally. Why dilute divine bloodline with inferior stock when you could marry within the sacred family? Gold catches sunlight in Cusco. Quipu knots record lineages with mathematical precision. A priest chews coca leaves and speaks of divine blood, blood that must not be diluted, must not be shared with common lineages, must not escape the sun's chosen family. The Sapa Inca, emperor of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, roughly 1438-1533 CE, married his full sister. This wasn't scandal, it was sacred requirement. The practice of royal sibling marriage among Inca elites is documented by multiple Spanish chroniclers writing shortly after conquest, most notably Pedro Chiesa de Leon in his Chronicles of Peru, 1550s. These weren't distant legends. The Spanish encountered living Incas who practiced and defended the custom as essential to preserving divine essence. The logic was theological and political. The Sapa Inca was son of Inti, the sun god. His blood carried divinity. Mixing it with common blood weakened divine potency and compromised the imperial lineage's supernatural authority. Solution: marry within the divine bloodline. The closest pure match was a full sister. The principal wife, the Koya, was typically the Sapa Inca's full sister. She shared his divine parentage and produced the most legitimate heirs. Secondary wives came from within the broader royal family or from noble lineages, creating alliances while the primary succession remained pure. Garcilaso de la Vega, himself of mixed Inca and Spanish heritage writing in the late 16th century, defended the practice as theological necessity, not perversion. He argued that Incas understood their emperors as fundamentally different beings than common humans. Different rules applied to gods made flesh. The practice wasn't unique to the Inca among Andean cultures, though it reached its fullest expression in Cuzco. Archaeological evidence of Inca royal mummies and genealogical reconstructions from multiple chroniclers show the pattern repeated across generations. DNA analysis of royal mummies has confirmed close kin relationships, though the genetic impacts are complex to interpret. What made this particularly systematic was its combination with polygamy. The Sapa Inca might have dozens or hundreds of secondary wives and concubines, producing numerous offspring, but only the children of the sister wife Koya were considered fully divine and eligible for succession to the imperial throne. All others were lesser royals, privileged but fundamentally different in status. The Spanish, despite accepting first-cousin marriage in their own nobility and with papal dispensation even allowing uncle-niece unions in certain circumstances, were horrified by sibling marriage. They condemned it as barbaric proof of Inca moral degradation, requiring Christian correction. The irony that Spanish royal families also practiced close-kin marriage to preserve bloodline purity, just drawing the line 1 degree further out than the Incas, was apparently lost on them. What happens when divine bloodline must remain pure? Genetic problems accumulate. While the Inca Empire's relatively short duration, less than a century of major expansion, meant limited generational depth for genetic issues to fully manifest, the practice couldn't have continued indefinitely, without consequence. The Spanish conquest ended the system before its biological limits became empire-threatening. The sister wife system reveals how thoroughly marriage could be subordinated to lineage ideology, personal compatibility, emotional connection, individual preference. These were irrelevant to the theological requirements of divine bloodline. The Sapa Inca and Koya weren't partners in the modern sense. They were breeding pair chosen by cosmology. Lineage obsession could take other forms. Some systems bound widows to their dead husbands' brothers, whether anyone wanted it or not. Sand and sun, the city gate where legal matters are decided. A man stands before elders, refusing his duty. His dead brother's widow stands nearby. Not his wife, not exactly a stranger, caught between categories. Ancient Israelite law, codified in texts dating roughly to the 7th-6th centuries BCE, but reflecting earlier customs, included a specific provision called levirate marriage. The term comes from Latin levir, brother-in-law, but the practice is described in Deuteronomy 25:5-10. The mechanics. If a married man died without sons, his brother was obligated to marry the widow. The first son of this new union would be counted as the dead brother's heir, continuing his name and inheritance. The widow couldn't marry outside the family. The brother couldn't refuse without social penalty. The text is explicit. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger, Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. This wasn't optional, it was legal requirement. But what if the brother refused? Deuteronomy provides a ritual of public shaming. The widow approached the refusing brother before the elders at the city gate. She removed his sandal and spat in his face, declaring, "So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house." His family would forever carry the label, "the house of him who had his sandal pulled off." A mark of shame. The procedure reveals the conflicting priorities. The primary goal wasn't the widow's welfare, though it provided her with support. The goal was patrilineal continuity, ensuring the dead man's name and property remained in his family line. The widow was the vessel for this continuity. But the system served the dead man and his lineage, not her autonomy. Later, rabbinic discussions, preserved in the Mishnah and Talmud, compiled roughly 200–500 CE, but preserving earlier oral traditions, elaborate on levirate complications. What if multiple brothers existed? The eldest had first obligation. What if the widow preferred a different brother? Irrelevant. Obligation fell by birth order. What if the brother was already married? He took her as an additional wife. What if she was past childbearing? Complex discussions about whether the obligation persisted. The practice appears in narrative texts as well. The Book of Ruth depicts a variation involving a more distant relative when no brother existed. The story presents the custom positively. Ruth's marriage to Boaz secures her future and continues her dead husband's name. But the narrative also reveals the transactional nature. Boaz negotiates for Ruth like he'd negotiate for a field, explicitly linking her to property redemption. The practice persisted in some Jewish communities into the Talmudic period and beyond, though with modifications. Eventually, a ritual called halitzah, the sandal, removal ceremony, became preferred over actual levirate marriage in many Jewish legal traditions, allowing both widow and brother to move on without marriage. But the law's existence reveals how thoroughly marriage served family continuity over individual choice. The widow wasn't free, the brother wasn't free. Both were caught in a system prioritizing abstract lineage over living persons. Some legal systems made other taboos ritually acceptable when family needs demanded it. Ahatusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, roughly 1400 BCE. Clay tablets in the archive contain law codes, meticulous, comprehensive, and in certain provisions, disturbing even by ancient standards. The Hittite laws, excavated in the early 20th century and translated over subsequent decades, address marriage, sex, and boundaries between human and animal, permissible and forbidden. What they reveal is a society that felt compelled to explicitly prohibit certain acts, implying these prohibitions were necessary. People were doing these things. The laws list sexual prohibitions in order of severity. Sex with one's mother, daughter, or son receives death penalty. Sex with animals is addressed in multiple provisions with varied penalties depending on the animal and circumstances. The law's very specificity, distinguishing between different animals, different contexts, suggests these weren't theoretical scenarios. Tablet 2, provisions 187–200, addresses bestiality with a casualness that shocks modern readers. Some acts bring death penalty and ritual impurity requiring purification. Others bring merely exile or payment of restitution. Still others, and this is the truly disturbing part, appear permitted under specific conditions, though scholarly debate rages over translation nuances that might change these interpretations dramatically. Modern Hittitologists debate whether some provisions describe bestiality occurring as part of ritual practice, agricultural fertility rites, or purely practical contexts of shepherds spending months isolated with livestock. The texts don't explain cultural context clearly enough for certainty. What's undeniable is that Hittite law felt compelled to regulate these acts in detail, creating a graduated scale of acceptability and penalty that implies prevalence. Certain marriage regulations appear in the same legal sections, suggesting the Hittites categorized both under similar logic. Control of reproduction and bloodline. A man could not marry his mother, sister, daughter, or son's wife, but he could marry his brother's wife after the brother's death, a form of levirate custom. He could marry multiple women simultaneously without restriction on number. The purification rituals following forbidden acts reveal Hittite understanding of pollution and sanctity. Some sexual transgressions brought ritual impurity requiring elaborate cleansing, sacrifices, ritual washing, exile from the community for a period, destruction of contaminated objects. The pollution wasn't just personal, it threatened the entire community's relationship with the gods. Provisions addressing what happens when a man dies during sex with an animal, or when forbidden relations occur during religious festivals, suggest these weren't rare hypotheticals. Law codes address common problems, requiring clear guidance for judges and priests. It's critical to note that scholarly interpretation of these laws remains contested. Some translations emphasize harsh penalties for all bestiality. Others argue certain provisions distinguished ritual contexts where fertility religion met agriculture in ways modern readers can barely comprehend. Still others suggest corruption in textual transmission created ambiguities that didn't exist in the original. What's indisputable is that Hittite law regulated sexual boundaries with meticulous attention, placed these regulations within sections also addressing marriage and reproduction, and implied a world where legal authorities regularly confronted situations requiring judgment on acts existing at the extreme edge of the culturally thinkable. Elsewhere, marriage customs created rotating access rather than permanent partnership. Kyoto, around 900 Balmy 1100 CE. Silk screens partition aristocratic spaces. The scent of incense, sandalwood, aloes wood, clings to layered silk robes. A woman waits, knowing he might visit tonight. Or he might go to another woman, she has no say. Heian period. Japan, 794 to 1185 CE, developed a unique marriage system among the aristocracy, documented extensively in court literature, particularly The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, early 11th century, and various court diaries and poetry collections. Elite marriages weren't cohabitation arrangements. Instead, men visited women, wives, and recognized concubines in the women's residences, usually their father's household. A man maintained relationships with multiple women simultaneously, rotating visits based on preference, political necessity, and rank requirements. Women waited. The system was called tsumadoi, wife visiting measures. Marriage. A man courted a woman through poetry and intermediaries. If her family approved, he visited at night, leaving before dawn. After 3 consecutive nights, the relationship was recognized as marriage by having morning after rice cakes served, but this didn't create exclusive bonds or cohabitation. The wife remained in her father's house, raising any children born from the union. Her status depended on her father's rank and the husband's other commitments. A high-ranking woman from a powerful family might see her husband regularly and wield significant influence. A lower-status wife or concubine might be visited rarely, essentially maintaining a household in hope of occasional contact. Rank determined access. The principal wife, Kita no Kata, typically the woman from the highest-ranking family, held formal precedence and her sons had priority in inheritance. But rank didn't guarantee affection or frequent visits. A favorite concubine might receive more attention than a neglected principal wife. The Tale of Genji depicts this system through protagonist Genji's complex romantic life. A principal wife he barely visits, a beloved concubine who holds his heart, numerous affairs with ladies-in-waiting and other men's wives, and women who wait months or years between visits. The novel presents this as normal, even romantic, women writing beautiful, longing poetry about rare encounters. But court diaries reveal loneliness and uncertainty. Women recorded anxiety about whether tonight would bring a visit, jealousy of rivals, the shame of decreased attention, signaling decreased status, and the practical worries of raising children, essentially as single mothers, in their father's household. The system served political alliance building. Multiple marriages to women from different powerful families created networks of obligation and support. Children from each union tied the husband to the wife's father's faction, but the women bore the emotional cost of shared, partial, unpredictable access to men who might have 5, 10, 15 other equally married women. Women's legal standing was fragile. They couldn't own property independently in most cases. They couldn't determine which children they'd raise. Some were given away or adopted out. They couldn't prevent their husband from taking additional wives or concubines. They could lose status instantly if their father's political position weakened or if their husband's interest waned. The system lasted centuries, eventually evolving toward more cohabitation-based marriages in later medieval periods. But for generations of Heian aristocratic women, marriage meant waiting behind silk screens, perfuming sleeves for a visitor who might not come, writing poetry about loneliness while serving tea. Some cultures took bloodline purity to its theological extreme, making incest the highest virtue. Fire temple flames reflect off polished metal. Barsum, bundles of sacred twigs, lay on the altar. A priest speaks of purity, of virtue, of the highest form of marriage, exploitative, next of kin marriage, father-daughter, mother-son, brother-sister, not sin, salvation. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion traditionally founded by the prophet Zoroaster, dates contested, possibly 2nd millennium BCE, developed complex purity laws. Among the most controversial to modern scholars and most defended by certain ancient texts was exploitative, also transliterated as kvayatvaditha, close kin marriage as religiously meritorious act. The practice is referenced in multiple Middle Persian, Pahlavi texts from the Sasanian period, 224-651 CE, including the Denkard, Bundaheshen, and various rivayats. These texts, compiled centuries after Zoroaster, but claiming to preserve ancient teachings, explicitly endorse next of kin marriage as generating religious merit, canceling sins, and strengthening the soul's position in the afterlife. Denkard Book 3, for instance, discusses Zuidada as one of the most meritorious acts possible, superior to ordinary marriage. Some texts specify that father-daughter or brother-sister unions carry particular spiritual weight. The logic appears to be about maintaining purity, bloodline remaining within itself, avoiding external pollution. But here's where it gets complicated. Scholars fiercely debate scope and practice. Did Zoroastrians actually practice parent-child or sibling marriage? Or were these texts theoretical, aspirational, or misunderstood? Greco-Roman writers reported Persians practiced incestuous marriage, but these reports come from hostile outsiders, potentially exaggerating to paint Persians as barbarians. Some scholars argue Zuidada referred to cousin marriage, close kin but not immediate family, and that later texts or translation errors intensified the language. Others point to evidence from Sasanian period legal documents and marriage contracts suggesting some elite families did practice sibling marriage, particularly in priestly classes. The theological justification involved Zoroastrian cosmology's emphasis on maintaining pure creation against evil corruption. Ahura Mazda created good, pure order. Angra Mainyu brought corruption and mixture. Keeping bloodlines pure, refusing outside admixture, symbolically aligned with maintaining cosmic order against chaos. Certain texts suggest Zuidada marriages produced offspring with enhanced spiritual qualities or helped maintain priestly lineage's purity necessary for effective ritual performance. The Mobad, high priests, particularly needed uncorrupted lineage to properly mediate between human and divine realms. Arab-Muslim conquests of Persia in the 7th century CE brought explicit condemnation of the practice from Islamic law, which strictly forbids close kin marriage. Post-conquest Zoroastrian communities faced persecution partly over this custom. Some abandoned it, if it was indeed practiced under pressure. Others maintained it, at least according to their accusers. Modern Zoroastrian communities emphatically reject any parent-child or sibling marriage, considering such practices ancient aberrations if they existed at all, or mistranslations of texts that advocated only cousin marriage. The controversy remains heated because it touches both historical reputation and theological interpretation of sacred texts. What's undeniable is that respected Zoroastrian religious texts from the Sasanian period contain language that appears to endorse, even celebrate, forms of marriage that nearly all modern cultures consider incestuous. Whether the practice matched the preaching remains debated, but the preaching existed in writing, preserved for centuries. In some harsh environments, multiple husbands for one wife became economic necessity rather than religious choice. Thin air. Yak butter lamps flicker. The wind outside threatens to tear prayer flags from ropes. Inside, 3 men sit, brothers, all married to the same woman. This isn't crisis, it's strategy. Fraternal polyandry, multiple brothers sharing one wife, developed in Tibet and adjacent Himalayan regions as pragmatic response to harsh environment and economic necessity. The custom is documented in historical ethnographies from the 18th century onward, travel accounts, and local legal traditions that persisted into the 20th century. The logic is land preservation. In mountainous regions where arable land is scarce and fragmentation through inheritance would render plots too small for survival, keeping property intact became essential. If 3 brothers each married separately and each had sons, the family land would eventually split into tiny, non-viable pieces. Solution? Brothers don't divide the property. They share a wife, raise children communally, and keep the estate intact across generations. All children are considered offspring of all brothers legally, regardless of biological paternity. Inheritance passes to the next generation as a unit. The system required acceptance from all parties, but prioritized elder brother's choice of bride. Once the eldest married, his younger brothers automatically became co-husbands to the same woman unless they chose to leave the household and forfeit inheritance rights. Most stayed. The alternative was poverty. How did it work practically? The wife managed one household with all brothers contributing labor and resources. She might develop preferences among husbands, but couldn't legally acknowledge them. Sexual access was theoretically equal, though elder brothers often claimed precedence. Children called all brothers father without distinction. For women, the system had advantages and disadvantages. Advantages: economic security, multiple male laborers supporting one household, distributed burden of domestic work with assistance from brother husbands. Disadvantages: navigating multiple male egos and demands, potential for favoritism and conflict, no choice in additional husbands once initial marriage agreed. British ethnographer Beatrice Miller conducted field research in the 1950s, the 60s, documenting polyandry in Tibetan communities. She found the system stable when economic necessity remained strong, but breaking down as economic conditions changed, or when individuals had access to land elsewhere. Tibetan legal traditions recognized polyandry formally. Property documents listed all brothers as co-husbands. Monastic records acknowledged the practice. It wasn't secret or shameful. It was practical adaptation to environment where survival trumped romantic ideals. The custom wasn't unique to Tibet. Similar practices existed in parts of Ladakh, Nepal, and other Himalayan cultures, always in areas with land scarcity and difficult agricultural conditions. Where land was more abundant, monogamy dominated. Where land was desperately scarce, polyandry emerged. But the practice required subordinating individual desires to collective economic need. A younger brother, who loved a different woman, had no recourse. He shared his older brother's wife or left penniless. A wife who found one husband intolerable couldn't divorce him without divorcing all, ending the marriage entirely. Chinese control of Tibet and modernization efforts in the late 20th century actively discouraged polyandry, though some remote communities maintained the practice into recent decades. Economic development and increased access to non-agricultural employment reduced the necessity that created the custom. The system reveals marriage as economic institution adaptable to environmental pressures. Where nuclear family monogamy threatened survival, cultures developed alternatives, however strange to outside observers: property before passion, survival before sentiment. The pattern had spread across mountains and empires, and it was still deepening. Babylon. Ishtar's temple rises against the sky, ziggurat steps ascending toward divine realms. Inside, women dedicated to the goddess perform rituals. But what kind of rituals? For over 2 millennia, historians claimed ancient Mesopotamian temples practiced sacred prostitution, women serving as temple prostitutes, having sex with worshippers as religious duty, channeling divine fertility through bodily union. The primary source: Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE in his Histories, Book I. Herodotus describes a Babylonian custom requiring every woman once in her lifetime to sit in Ishtar's temple precinct and have sex with a stranger who throws a coin into her lap as offering to the goddess. She must accept the first man who propositions her, regardless of attraction. Only after this act could she return home and marry normally. The account is vivid, specific, and for centuries accepted as fact. Victorian historians loved it. Proof ancient pagans were sexually degraded, validating Christian moral superiority. Early 20th century scholars used it to theorize about sacred marriage rituals between gods and humans, mediated through temple priestesses. Problem: almost no cuneiform evidence supports it. Modern Assyriologists who can actually read Mesopotamian primary sources in original language, thousands of temple administrative tablets, priestly records, religious texts, find no clear evidence of institutionalized sacred prostitution. Temple women existed in various roles: priestesses, scribes, administrators, ritual performers. Some may have been sexually active, but systematic temple-based prostitution as religious requirement? The evidence is thin to non-existent. Scholars now suspect Herodotus misunderstood, exaggerated, or conflated different customs. He was writing centuries after the practices he described, relying on informants whose language he might have understood imperfectly. His account fits Greek stereotypes about Eastern barbarians: sexually exotic, morally degenerate, religiously bizarre. What probably existed: diverse temple roles for women, some connected to fertility religion, some involving ritual sexuality in specific ceremonial contexts, others purely administrative. The practice was likely complex, varied by city and period, and bore little resemblance to Herodotus's lurid description. But for 2,400 years, Herodotus's account shaped understanding of Mesopotamian religion and women's roles. Art depicted temple prostitutes. Novels romanticized sacred sex. Scholars built theories on sand. The debate reveals how easily stories about ancient sexual practices become accepted as fact, especially when they confirm existing prejudices. Sacred prostitution fit narratives about pagan moral degradation. Debunking it required decades of painstaking linguistic and archaeological work. This matters for our list, because it shows how carefully we must evaluate ancient marriage and sexual customs. Some practices that seem too perverse to believe are well documented. Others that seem plausible are myths. The difference is evidence, not colorful ancient historians, but mundane administrative records, legal codes, and archaeological context. The pattern isn't just what ancient peoples did. It's what later cultures claim they did, and why. Trial marriages judged fertility like livestock breeding. Mist over Irish hills. Two people exchange vows before witnesses, not in a church, but at an ancient site marked by stone. The ceremony is binding, but not forever. 1 year and a day. Then reassessment. Brehon laws, the indigenous legal system of medieval Ireland, roughly 7th to 17th centuries CE, based on earlier oral traditions, codified elaborate gradations of marriage with different rights, obligations, and dissolution procedures. Among the most foreign to modern sensibilities was the trial marriage provision. The laws recognized at least 9 types of marriage, varying by property contributions, status, consent, and duration. Trial marriage allowed a couple to cohabit for a year and a day with full legal recognition, but with the understanding that either party could walk away after that period if unsatisfied, particularly if no children had been born. The trial period tested compatibility and fertility. In a pre-industrial agricultural society where survival depended on productive labor and successful reproduction, both were economically crucial. A barren marriage threatened family continuity and economic stability. Trial marriage allowed assessment before permanent commitment. The law texts, preserved in medieval manuscripts but reflecting earlier oral legal tradition, specified different bride wealth obligations depending on marriage type. A trial marriage required less bride wealth initially, but would be adjusted upward if the marriage became permanent. If the marriage ended after a year, bride wealth was partially refunded based on complex calculation involving fault determination and whether conception had occurred. Here's the unbelievable but true part. If the trial marriage produced a child, the marriage typically became permanent, and bride wealth obligations adjusted upward. If no child appeared, dissolution was simpler, but not without consequence. The woman's fertility was now questioned, the man's as well. Both faced reduced marriage prospects afterward. Medieval Irish law commentaries discuss scenarios. What if the wife became pregnant but miscarried during the trial year? What if she concealed pregnancy until after dissolution? What if the husband proved impotent? Gradations of responsibility and refund provisions addressed each scenario. The system wasn't egalitarian. Men had more freedom to initiate divorce than women across most marriage types. But women in higher status marriages, particularly those who brought substantial property, could initiate separation under specific circumstances. Trial marriage gave women one opportunity to exit a bad match without the social catastrophe of divorce from permanent marriage. The Catholic Church condemned trial marriage as concubinage and worked to eliminate it as Christianity solidified control over Irish legal culture. By the late medieval period, church law increasingly superseded Brehon traditions, though pockets of resistance persisted. But for centuries, Irish law recognized that testing compatibility and fertility before permanent commitment might be wiser than binding two people irrevocably, only to face disaster. The modern dating period is arguably a secular version of the same concept, though without the legal recognition or explicit fertility assessment. Egypt would inscribe the dynastic version of bloodline obsession in stone monuments meant to last forever. Gold everywhere, on thrones, on walls, on skin. The Nile Delta sun reflects off polished surfaces in the palace at Amarna. A pharaoh marries. The bride is his sister, later his daughter. The bloodline must remain pure. The bloodline must remain divine. Ancient Egyptian royal families, particularly during the New Kingdom, 1550, 1077 BCE, and the Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BCE, practiced close kin marriage with frequency and openness that distinguished them even among ancient cultures comfortable with cousin marriage. The 18th dynasty Amarna period provides clear evidence. Akhenaten married his sister Nefertiti, or possibly his half-sister. Sources disagree on her exact parentage. Their 6 daughters included Ankhesenamun, who married her father's successor Tutankhamun, who was likely her half-brother or possibly full brother. After Tutankhamun's death, Ankhesenamun was married to the next pharaoh, Ai, her grandfather. The Amarna letters and tomb inscriptions from the period don't hide these relationships. They're stated openly because they weren't shameful. They were politically and theologically necessary. The logic paralleled the Inca system. Pharaohs were divine, descended from gods, particularly Ra, the sun god. Divine essence couldn't be diluted with common blood. Marrying within the royal family, preferably the most direct line, maintained divine purity necessary for legitimate rule. The Ptolemaic dynasty, 305-30 BCE, the Greek-Egyptian royal line culminating with Cleopatra Sesavin, practiced brother-sister marriage systematically. Ptolemy the Sceau married his full sister, Arsinoe II. Ptolemy the Sixth married his sister Cleopatra the Sceau. Ptolemy VIII married 2 of his nieces in succession, after previously being married to his sister. Cleopatra VII married 2 younger brothers in succession, Ptolemy the and Ptolemy the Phaistos, before her famous romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. These weren't secret marriages hidden from public knowledge. Official papyri, temple inscriptions, and royal titulature openly identified these sibling unions. Ptolemaic queens bore titles explicitly identifying them as sister wives. Sister-loving goddess, and similar epithets appeared in formal documents. The practice created genetic problems. Examination of royal mummies reveals health issues consistent with generations of inbreeding, shorter statures, various malformations, potentially reduced fertility. Tutankhamun's mummy shows evidence of genetic disorders likely resulting from close kin parentage across multiple generations. Art from the Amarna period depicts Akhenaten with unusual physical features, elongated skull, pronounced hips, slender limbs. Some scholars attribute this to artistic style, reflecting Akhenaten's religious reforms. Others argue it depicts actual genetic abnormalities from dynastic inbreeding, manifesting visibly in the royal line. Genealogical reconstructions using multiple sources, king lists, tomb inscriptions, temple records, archaeological evidence, show the pattern repeating. Father-daughter unions are debated and rare, but sibling marriages are undeniable and frequent, particularly in the Ptolemaic period where documentation is most complete. The practice reveals the ultimate subordination of personal welfare to dynastic ideology. Royal siblings raised together from childhood weren't lovers who chose each other. They were chess pieces moved by state necessity. The pharaoh's sister became his wife because theology and politics demanded it, regardless of personal feeling, biological risk, or human cost. Athens would develop its own system of marriage as political gatekeeping, though focused on citizenship rather than divinity. The Panics, Athens, 451 BCE. Pericles proposes a law before the assembled citizens. It seems simple. Only children born from two Athenian citizen parents will hold citizenship. Marriage just became border patrol for the polis. The Periclean citizenship law fundamentally altered Athenian marriage by turning it into a mechanism for policing the citizen body. Prior to 451 BCE, Athenian men could marry foreign women and their children would still be citizens. After Pericles' law, both parents must be citizens, and citizenship for women was defined through their citizen fathers and passed only through marriage to citizen men. The law appears in multiple classical sources, including Aristotle's Athenian Constitution and Plutarch's Life of Pericles. Its immediate effect was to reduce the citizen population by making many existing children illegitimate and ineligible for citizenship. Its long-term effect was to make marriage choice a political act with consequences for children's rights. Athenian women couldn't be citizens in the political sense. They couldn't vote, hold office, or participate in democratic institutions, but they could possess citizenship status that they transmitted to children through legitimate marriage with citizen men. This made them gatekeepers despite lacking political power. Foreign women, regardless of wealth, status, or father's position in their home city, couldn't transmit Athenian citizenship. A child born from an Athenian man and a foreign woman was notos, illegitimate, barred from citizenship, inheritance rights limited, unable to participate in civic religion or institutions. Court orations from 4th century Athens show how the law weaponized marriage. Families challenged opponents' citizenship by claiming their mothers or grandmothers were foreign. Producing witnesses to testify about a woman's parentage decades after her death became crucial to maintaining male descendant citizenship. Women's identities and histories were subject to public scrutiny and legal challenge. The law also affected elite marriage strategy. Previously wealthy Athenians might marry foreign noblewomen to build international alliances. After 451 BCE, such marriages produced non-citizen children, severely limiting their utility. Elite families had to marry within the citizen body, or accept their children would be excluded from political life. Ironically, Pericles himself later begged the assembly to grant citizenship to his son by his foreign partner, Aspasia of Miletus. The assembly made an exception, but the law remained. Citizenship became scarce, jealously guarded, passed through bodies policed by law. The system created particular hardship during and after wars. The Peloponnesian War, 431-404 BCE, killed enormous numbers of Athenian men. Citizen women faced reduced marriage prospects. The impulse might have been to allow citizenship through mothers alone or to accept foreign husbands, but the law forbade it. The citizen body shrank. After Athens' defeat and the brief oligarchic regime, 404-403 BCE, the democracy restored in 403 BCE briefly reconsidered the citizenship law, but ultimately maintained it. Citizenship remained bounded by marriage to citizen fathers, passed through marriage to citizen men, protected by policing women's bodies and marriages. The law transformed marriage from private arrangement to public interest. Every marriage of a citizen became the city's business because it affected the composition of the citizen body. Women's bodies became borders the city defended against foreign infiltration. In Maya territories, elites would sanctify marriage and alliance through blood in ways that made citizenship debates seem tame. Yaxchilan, 709 CE. Lintel 24 depicts Lady Zouk performing ritual bloodletting. She pulls a thorned rope through her tongue, the blood falling onto bark paper in a basket. This isn't penance. This is power. This is her marriage to the king, shield jaguar, made sacred through sacrificial pain. Classic period, Maya civilization, roughly 250 or 900 CE, embedded bloodletting into elite ritual life, and marriage ceremonies among royal families often included these practices as essential components. The evidence comes from multiple sources: stone lintels, murals, ceramic scenes, and hieroglyphic texts describing royal marriages and alliance formations. Yaxchilan's sculptural program provides the most detailed visual evidence. Lintels 24 to 26 in structure 23 depict Lady Tsuk, primary wife of Shield Jaguar II, performing bloodletting rituals. Lintel 24 shows her pulling a thorned rope through her pierced tongue while Shield Jaguar holds a torch. Lintel 25 depicts her visioned serpent, the supernatural entity appearing from her blood sacrifice, emerging from the basket containing blood-soaked bark paper. These weren't private religious experiences. They were public ceremonies witnessed by the court, commemorated in permanent stone monuments, and essential to legitimizing royal power and marital alliances. The hieroglyphic text on Lintel 25 dates the ceremony and identifies the actors. This was commissioned art meant to proclaim Lady Tsuk's piety and the sacred nature of her marriage. Her willingness to shed blood, repeatedly publicly, validated her position as primary royal wife. Bonampak murals, late 8th century CE, provide additional evidence of bloodletting in ceremonial contexts involving royal families. Room 1 murals show preparation for ceremony, including bloodletting implements. Room 2 depicts battle, war captives taken. Room 3 shows bloodletting by nobles, including women, as part of victory celebration and sacrifice of captives. Marriage alliances were formalized and renewed through similar ceremonial contexts. The bloodletting itself used specialized tools: stingray spines, obsidian blades, maguey thorns. Archaeologists find these cached in royal tombs and ceremonial contexts. The act targeted specific body parts: tongue, ears, genitals. The pain was intense, intentional, understood as necessary sacrifice to feed the gods and maintain cosmic order. For women especially, bloodletting during marriage ceremonies demonstrated their worthiness. Elite Maya women weren't passive participants in royal religion. They were ritual performers whose blood sacrifice validated their position. A royal wife who couldn't or wouldn't let blood had failed a fundamental requirement. But bloodletting was also tied to warfare, political alliance, and lineage. When kingdoms formed marriage alliances, a king's daughter sent to marry another city's ruler, the marriage ceremony included bloodletting rituals that bound the family supernaturally as well as politically. The shared blood sacrifice created cosmic connections between lineages. Epigrapher David Stewart's work, deciphering Maya hieroglyphs, has revealed numerous texts describing royal marriages, often in contexts that include ceremony involving blood offering. A princess's marriage to a foreign king wasn't just political treaty. It was religious obligation, creating spiritual bonds between polities. The practice required cultivating pain tolerance from childhood. Elite Maya children, particularly girls destined for high-status marriage, trained in bloodletting rituals from young ages, learning to endure the stingray spine through the tongue without flinching, understanding it as noble duty. Marriage became inseparable from sacrifice. Love, if it existed, wasn't the foundation. Cosmic order was, maintained through blood, dripped on bark paper by women whose worthiness was measured in wounds. Polyandry would appear again, in multiple Himalayan variations, always with the same economic logic. The pattern repeats in Ladakh, in Nepal, in Bhutan. Wherever mountains make land scarce and survival precarious, the same solution emerges: multiple brothers, one wife, unified property. We've seen Tibetan fraternal polyandry, but the practice extended throughout the Himalayan cultural region, with variations reflecting local conditions and legal traditions. The consistency across geography suggests not cultural borrowing, but parallel evolution, similar pressures producing similar adaptations. In Ladakh, the westernmost region of the Himalayas, anthropologist Marvin Levine documented polyandry persisting into the 1980s. His research in several villages found the practice openly acknowledged and socially normal where land scarcity remained acute. Brothers married jointly, shared one wife, and raised children as collective fathers. The Ladakhi variant included additional complexity, in some cases, polyandry combined with polygyny. A set of brothers might marry one woman, then later add a second wife if the family prospered and could support additional members. Each wife technically belonged to all brothers, though practical sleeping arrangements and daily life created de facto preferences and pairings. Nepali hill communities, particularly among Sherpa and certain Tibeto-Burman groups, practiced similar systems. Anthropologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf studied Sherpa polyandry in the 1960s, 1970s, documenting the economic logic. High-altitude agriculture and trade required substantial land or livestock holdings to sustain a family. Division meant poverty, unity meant survival. What united all variants was explicit subordination of emotional preference to economic necessity. Love might develop between the wife and one particular brother, but the marriage remained legally and socially collective. Sexual jealousy was discouraged as selfish and destructive. Children couldn't favor one father over others. The system required suppressing individual desire for collective welfare. Inheritance customs reinforced the practice. In most Himalayan polyandrous societies, land passed to the eldest son's generation as a unit. If that generation consisted of multiple brothers who'd remained joint in marriage and property, the next generation inherited jointly. Only when families became wealthy enough to support division did brothers split and form separate monogamous households. The wife's experience varied by circumstance. Some women appreciated economic security and reduced domestic burden. Multiple husbands meant more labor for field work, trade, and household maintenance. Other women chafed at navigating multiple men's demands, mediating conflicts, and lacking a single partner with whom to form deep emotional bonds. Children's experience was psychologically complex. Anthropological research found some children forming preferences for particular fathers, usually recognizing biological paternity through resemblance or birth timing, but were trained to suppress these preferences publicly. The official fiction was collective paternity, equal regardless of biology. Religious traditions varied in accepting polyandry. Tibetan Buddhism accommodated it pragmatically. Monks might counsel against excessive attachment in any marriage form, making polyandry no worse than monogamy spiritually. Hindu communities in Nepal often found the practice in tension with religious texts presuming monogamous ideals, creating tension between local custom and pan-Indian religious standards. The practice declined throughout the 20th century as economic modernization, education, and government policies promoting monogamous marriage spread. Younger generations increasingly rejected polyandry as old-fashioned, preferring romantic love marriages even at cost of dividing family property. But for centuries, across vast mountain territories, multiple brothers shared one wife because the alternative, property division, meant slow starvation. Marriage served survival, not sentiment. Property came before passion. Some religious traditions made close kin marriage sacred duty. Return to fire temples, to Persian religious texts that make Zoroastrian's Vedota seem not aberration, but principle extended through centuries. Multiple Middle Eastern cultures influenced by Persian tradition developed systems where bloodline purity became theological requirement. Medieval Persian Zoroastrian communities, particularly in Yazd and Kerman regions, where Zoroastrian populations persisted after Islamic conquest, maintained marriage practices that horrified Muslim neighbors and fascinated European travelers. Marco Polo, traveling through Persia in the late 13th century, reported with shock that Persians practiced marriage between close relatives including siblings. While his account is third-hand and potentially exaggerated, later European travelers confirmed that some Zoroastrian communities defended cousin marriage at minimum, and possibly closer kin unions as religiously sanctioned. The Pahlavi literature, Middle Persian texts from the Sasanian period preserved and copied in later centuries, continued to reference Zwaydada marriage as generating religious merit. The Sad Dar, a later Zoroastrian text, possibly 15th-17th century, still mentions close kin marriage in positive terms, though with increasing ambiguity about exactly which degree of kinship is meant. The theological justification remained consistent, maintaining purity of creation against the mixing and corruption introduced by Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the physical world is battleground between good and evil, order and chaos, purity and pollution. Marriage outside one's kin group introduced foreign elements into sacred bloodlines. For priestly families especially, the Mobeds, who maintained religious tradition and performed essential rituals, bloodline purity allegedly affected ritual efficacy. A priest with mixed ancestry might lack full spiritual power to properly mediate between human and divine realms. Parsi communities in India, Zoroastrians who fled Persian Islamic persecution and settled primarily in Gujarat around the 8th–10th centuries CE, developed different practices over time. By the 19th–20th centuries, when British colonial observers documented Parsi customs, close kin marriage beyond first cousins had largely ceased. But historical records suggest earlier Parsi communities may have practiced it, with gradual reform as the community adapted to Hindu and Islamic neighbors' horror at the custom. The practice, to the extent it existed, created theological paradoxes. Zoroastrianism teaches protection of health and welfare. Inbreeding causes genetic problems. How could harmful practice be religiously meritorious? Various theological explanations attempted resolution. Spiritual benefits outweigh physical costs. The merit generated protects offspring from harm. Only the most pure families can sustain the practice without degeneration. Modern Zoroastrian communities, both in Iran and the global diaspora, emphatically reject parent-child or sibling marriage. Many Zoroastrians consider even first-cousin marriage inadvisable due to genetic concerns. The community often argues historical texts were misunderstood, or that the practice, if real, applied only to ancient periods and was always rare. But the texts exist, the endorsements are in writing, and hostile observers from multiple cultures over many centuries reported the practice, suggesting it wasn't simply false rumor, but observable reality in at least some communities, some periods. The pattern suggests how powerful bloodline ideology can become when combined with religious authority. If salvation depends on bloodline purity, and purity requires breeding within the line, then even incest transforms from taboo to sacred duty. Biology submits to theology. In Egypt, even priestly inspections allegedly scrutinized bodies to enforce purity standards. Greco-Roman writers visiting Egypt described customs that shocked even jaded ancient travelers. Priestly or communal inspections of brides' virginity, allegedly conducted with mechanical precision and institutional authority. The accounts are frustratingly vague and potentially unreliable. Greco-Roman writers loved depicting Egyptians as sexually peculiar to emphasize Greek and Roman moral superiority. But the accounts persist across multiple sources, suggesting something ritualized was occurring even if details were exaggerated. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes Egyptian marriage customs, including provisions for verifying bridal virginity. He claims certain regions required brides to undergo inspection by designated women or priestesses before marriage could proceed. The process allegedly involved physical examination to confirm intact hymens. Other classical sources reference similar practices, though specifics vary. Some claim inspections were public, others private. Some attribute them to priestly authority, others to family elders. Some suggest they were universal, others limited to certain classes or regions. Archaeological evidence is sparse. Temple protocols and marriage contracts preserved in papyri don't clearly reference such inspections. The practice, if it existed, may have been customary rather than legally mandated, or may have varied significantly by period and location across Egypt's long history. What's clear is that Egyptian marriage contracts from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods show detailed concern with property, dowry, and virginity status. Contracts sometimes specify the bride's virgin status and assign different property arrangements accordingly. This suggests virginity had legal and economic consequences, even if inspection procedures remain poorly documented. The concept of institutional virgin testing reveals broader pattern. Marriage as system requiring verification of claims, particularly claims about women's bodies. If a bride's value partially depended on her virginity, ensuring accurate representation became economically rational, however degrading. Medieval European virginity inspections, documented far more thoroughly than ancient Egyptian versions, show how such systems function. Designated women, midwives, elder relatives, or in some cases male physicians, physically examine the bride, sometimes immediately before the wedding, sometimes after consummation to verify blood. The examination is witnessed, results documented, and disputes adjudicated by authorities if claims don't match findings. If Greco-Roman writers accurately describe something similar in Egypt, it represents institutional medical surveillance of women's sexuality as normal marriage procedure. The bride's body wasn't her own. It was evidence in a transaction requiring verification. The accounts are marked as alleged contested because we can't fully verify them. Classical writers lie. They exaggerate. They project their own cultural assumptions onto foreign customs they barely understood. But they're also our only sources for many ancient practices. Balancing skepticism with openness to disturbing possibilities is necessary. What unites Egyptian evidence with better documented European medieval examples is treating women's bodies as public interest, requiring inspection and documentation. Private anatomy becomes state concern when marriage involves property transfer and lineage legitimacy. In Rome, marriage created opportunities for sophisticated financial manipulation. Back to Rome, but this time focusing on the financial engineering that turned marriage into a legal battlefield where dowries were seized, contested, and weaponized. Roman marriage involved substantial property transfers. The bride's family provided dios, dowry, property, money, or valuable goods transferred to the husband's control during marriage. The dowry served multiple purposes: attracting desirable husbands, providing the wife some financial security, and creating economic links between families. But Roman law governing dowries was complex, creating opportunities for manipulation. The Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's 6th century CE legal compilation preserving earlier Roman law, includes extensive sections in the digest addressing dowry disputes, revealing how contentious these arrangements became. The basic principle: dowry belonged to the husband during marriage, but should return to the wife or her family if the marriage ended, unless fault lay with the wife. This created massive incentive to manipulate fault determinations. A classic dowry scam worked as follows. A man married a woman with substantial dowry. After gaining control of her property, he manufactured grounds for divorce, accusing her of adultery, easily fabricated with cooperative witnesses, wine drinking, considered serious moral failing, or religious transgression. If he successfully argued the divorce was her fault, he kept the dowry. She returned to her father's household impoverished, while the ex-husband enjoyed her family's wealth. Juristic sources document multiple cases of such manipulation. Wealthy widows with property were particularly vulnerable. A man might marry an older wealthy woman, gain control of her assets, then divorce her on contrived grounds, keeping the wealth. Women and their families developed counter-strategies. Marriage contracts, tabelle nuptiale, included increasingly detailed provisions attempting to protect dowry rights. Some contracts specified the dowry would remain the wife's property even during marriage, limiting the husband's control. Others required the husband to post security bonds guaranteeing dowry return. Legal cases turned on minute distinctions. Who initiated the divorce? On what grounds? Could the grounds be proven? What portion of dowry should return if fault was disputed? How should dowry be valued if it included property that had appreciated or depreciated? The Roman legal system developed sophisticated analysis of these questions. The digest preserves opinions from famous jurists debating hypothetical scenarios. What if the wife committed adultery, but the husband knew and continued cohabitation? What if the husband was impotent? What if dowry property was destroyed by fire? What if the wife's father died and she became independent, sui juris? This legal complexity meant wealth, access to good lawyers, and social connections determined outcomes. Poor women couldn't effectively litigate dowry disputes. Elite women could drag cases through courts for years, eventually recovering property through sheer legal attrition. The system reveals marriage as financial transaction governed by contract law, where love and partnership were secondary to property rights and economic calculation. The wedding was just the beginning. The real game was controlling assets and manipulating dissolution terms to maximize wealth retention. Ancient Judean law would take a different approach to marital transgression. Make the penalties so severe that the threat itself enforces order. Before we close, let's step back and observe the pattern from altitude. 30 customs from different continents, Different centuries, different religions, different languages. What connects them? Control. Every single case, stripped to its essence, reveals systems of control. Not isolated acts of individual cruelty, but institutional frameworks that normalized, legalized, and sanctified control over women's bodies, women's choices, women's lives. The mechanisms varied: auction blocks in Babylon, law codes in Assyria, religious rituals in India, military discipline in Sparta, property law in Rome, cosmological necessity in China, bloodline theology in Egypt. But the outcome was consistent: women as assets to be managed by male authority according to family, state, or religious interest. Consider the progression. It starts with property. Women openly bought and sold, their value calculated in silver and livestock. Then come testing protocols, virginity inspections, bride checks, blood-stained sheets as evidence. Then control of access, kidnapping rituals, visiting marriages, husbands' brothers claiming widows. Then bloodline management, sibling marriages, close kin unions, eugenic arrangements. Then extension beyond death, widow burning, ghost marriages, eternal bondage. Each escalation served specific interests. Property aspects benefited families building wealth and alliances. Testing protocols protected male investments in wives expected to be virgins. Access control maintained power structures where male authority determined female domestic and sexual availability. Bloodline management concentrated power and property in elite lineages. Death extensions prevented women from reclaiming autonomy, even in widowhood. And here's what makes this truly systemic rather than coincidental. These practices didn't emerge independently and randomly. They emerged predictably in societies reaching certain developmental stages. Agricultural societies that accumulated surplus and property developed marriage as property transfer. Stratified societies with hereditary inequality developed marriage as bloodline control. State-level societies developed marriage as demographic management. Religious hierarchies developed marriage as ritual requirement. The pattern transcends specific cultures because it responds to universal structural pressures in patriarchal societies organizing around property, inheritance, and male power. Different cultures innovated different specific practices, but they innovated within narrow parameters defined by similar goals: control female reproduction, manage property transmission, maintain power hierarchies, use women's bodies as currency in male-directed exchanges. The archaeological record confirms this. Wherever we find evidence of increasing social stratification, we find evidence of increasing control over women. Grave goods show status differentials. Skeletal remains show violence patterns. Legal codes show property provisions. Temple inscriptions show religious justifications. The material evidence and textual evidence align. Marriage evolved as control technology. What's haunting is how recently this changed, and how partially. The practices documented here dominated most of human civilization. They were normal for thousands of years. The notion of marriage as voluntary union between equals based on mutual affection, that's a historical eye blink, geographically limited, and still imperfectly realized. In 1900, most countries still treated married women as legal dependents. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names in many jurisdictions, couldn't have legal custody of children, couldn't refuse sex with their husbands. Marital rape wasn't a crime. It was considered a contradiction in terms. Marriage meant unlimited sexual access. That was the definition. In 1950, most countries still barred women from equal property rights, equal divorce rights, equal custody rights. Fathers still legally gave away daughters. Dowries and bride prices still flowed in many cultures. Child marriage remained common across much of Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. In 2000, just 25 years ago, many countries still had legal provisions treating women as property in marriage contexts. Marital rape was still legal in some jurisdictions. Child marriage still claimed millions of girls annually. Honor killings for sexual transgressions claimed thousands. Today, as you watch this video, approximately 12 million girls will be married before age 18 this year. Dowry deaths will kill thousands of Indian women. Female genital mutilation, often performed to make girls marriageable, will affect millions. Bride kidnapping persists in Central Asia. Child marriage remains legal in multiple U.S. states with parental consent. The customs documented here aren't fully past. They're partially past. They're evolving. They're adapting. The most extreme forms are increasingly prosecuted, but the logic, women as property, marriage as transaction, male authority over female bodies, that logic has remarkable staying power. So when we ask, how could they do these things? We're asking the wrong question. The right question is, how did anyone ever stop them? What changed? How did cultures that practiced these customs for centuries or millennia develop systems that, imperfectly, unevenly, incompletely, recognize women as autonomous persons rather than property? That's a story of resistance, reform, revolution. It's a story of women fighting legal systems designed to subordinate them, religious authorities claiming divine sanction for their subordination, economic structures that made independence nearly impossible, and cultural assumptions that treated their subordination as natural and inevitable. It's a story still being written, because the project isn't finished. The laws changed, the customs evolved. But ask any woman about her experiences with marriage, expectations, family pressure, cultural assumptions about her role, and you'll hear echoes. Faint perhaps, modernized, softened, but echoes nonetheless. The pattern was global. The pattern was persistent. The question is, what patterns persist? Documentary reflection, 904 words. S. Selective sharing of wives among elite men for eugenic purposes. Plutarch and Polybius both describe a Spartan practice where an older elite man, married but past his prime, would arrange for a younger, more vigorous man to impregnate his wife to produce stronger heirs. The husband retained paternity rights and family authority, but another man provided the genetic material. This wasn't adultery. It was orchestrated with the husband's permission, even at his instigation. The goal was offspring quality. If an older nobleman's potency waned but his wife remained fertile, bringing in younger stock improved the likelihood of healthy, strong sons who would become good soldiers. Plutarch presents this as yet another example of Spartan rationality overcoming emotional attachments. Jealousy was weakness. The state needed soldiers. Personal pride was secondary to demographic engineering. The practice was limited to elite families with resources and status to manage the social complexity. It wasn't widespread or practiced among common Spartans, but its existence among the aristocracy shows how far Sparta pushed subordination of family to military necessity. The woman had no recorded say in these arrangements. The decision was between her husband and the man selected to impregnate her, two men negotiating about her body and reproductive capacity while she played vessel. Some scholars question whether the practice was as common as Plutarch suggests, or whether he exaggerated to emphasize Spartan difference from other Greek cities. But the account's specificity and corroboration from multiple sources suggests some version existed. The pattern continues. Bodies managed for state purposes, reproduction divorced from relationship, women as means to eugenic ends. The oldest solution reappears in pharaonic Egypt. When lineage must remain pure, marry the daughter. The Arabian Peninsula before Islam, roughly 5th-6th centuries CE. The Jahiliyyah period, time of ignorance as later Muslims termed it. A man dies. His property is divided among heirs according to tribal custom and patriarchal authority. His sons receive camels, tents, weapons, trade goods, slaves. His brothers receive shares based on proximity of relationship. But property included something that horrified later Islamic reformers. His wives. Not just responsibility for supporting them, actual claim to them as inheritable property. Pre-Islamic Arabian customs, documented in early Islamic historical sources, particularly hadith collections and early tafsir, Quranic commentary, included a practice where a deceased man's son by another wife could claim his stepmother as inheritance. She became his wife unless she objected and could secure protection from male relatives willing to challenge the claim. The practice is described in accounts explaining the revelation of Quran 4:19, which explicitly forbids inheriting women against their will. O you who have believed, it is not lawful for you to inherit women by compulsion. The verse's specificity suggests the practice was common enough to require explicit prohibition, Early Islamic scholars and historians, writing in the 8th to 10th centuries CE, but describing pre-Islamic customs, present bequest marriage as prime example of jahiliyyah that Islam corrected. Their accounts may emphasize its prevalence to highlight Islamic reform's necessity, but the prohibition's explicit nature suggests the practice existed widely enough to require condemnation. The logic was economic and practical within tribal structures, where women's labor and reproductive capacity had clear value. Widows represented both obligations and assets. Obligations, they needed support. Food, shelter, protection in a harsh environment where unattached women were vulnerable. Assets, their labor, domestic work, textile production, animal husbandry, potential for bearing additional children who'd strengthen the tribe, and connections to their natal families that maintained alliances. Keeping widows within the deceased husband's family prevented dowry loss. The mahr, bride price, paid upon original marriage wouldn't need to be returned or paid again. It maintained alliances with the widow's birth family. It kept her labor and reproductive capacity as family assets rather than losing them to another tribe if she remarried outside. For the widow, the practice meant profound vulnerability. If the stepson claimed her, and the practice apparently gave him first right of claim, she became his wife, whether she desired it or not. The age difference could be minimal if the deceased man had married young, or substantial if the son was from an earlier marriage and the widow was a younger second or third wife. Her only escape was flight to her birth family, if they'd receive her and were powerful enough to resist the stepson's claim. Or she could seek protection from another male relative or tribal leader, willing to challenge the inheritance custom. But both options required male protection. She couldn't simply refuse and remain independent. Without male backing, her objection meant nothing. The practice reveals another dimension of women as property, not just transferable between father and husband during life, but inheritable like camels or trade goods after the husband's death. Her status as person with autonomous will was completely subordinated to her status as valuable asset that shouldn't leave family control. The Islamic prohibition was absolute and unambiguous. Inheriting women as property was forbidden. Widows became free to choose remarriage or to remain unmarried. They retained agency over their own future marriages. This represented significant reform of pre-Islamic custom, though enforcement varied by region and compliance wasn't immediate or universal. But the practice's existence, and its apparent prevalence given the explicit prohibition's necessity, reveals how thoroughly women could be commodified even within family structures. Not just in life as daughters and wives, but after their husband's death, they remained property to be claimed, assets to be inherited, resources to be managed by male family members according to economic and political calculation. The Jahiliyyah period's marriage customs provide window into pre-Islamic Arabian society, where women's autonomy was even more constrained than in many contemporary civilizations. The widow had no period of independence, no right to remain unmarried, no legal existence separate from male ownership. She transferred directly from dead husband's estate to stepson's possession unless extraordinary circumstances allowed escape. Islamic reform didn't eliminate all subordination of women. Later Islamic jurisprudence developed its own restrictions and hierarchies, but it did abolish this particular horror of treating widows as inheritable property transferable to stepsons. The prohibition stuck. Even the most conservative interpretations of Islamic law across subsequent centuries maintain that women cannot be inherited, that widows have right to choose their own remarriage, that a woman's will matters in determining her future. The contrast between pre-Islamic practice and Islamic prohibition demonstrates that reform was possible, that customs could change, that practices normalized for generations could be abolished when religious or moral authority condemned them forcefully enough. Sparta returns one final time with its most coldly eugenic arrangement. While returned to Sparta, the military state that subordinated every aspect of human life to the production of soldiers, we've seen Spartan bride kidnapping. Now, witness Sparta's eugenic innovation, approved sharing of wives among elite men for genetic optimization. Plutarch and Polybius, writing centuries after classical Sparta's peak, but drawing from earlier sources now lost, both describe a Spartan practice that challenges modern assumptions about ancient marriage. An older elite man, married but past his physical prime, would deliberately arrange for a younger, more vigorous man to impregnate his wife to produce stronger, healthier heirs. This wasn't adultery, it wasn't betrayal, it was orchestrated arrangement with the husband's permission, even at his instigation. The husband retained paternity rights, legal authority over the children, and his wife's primary loyalty. But another man, carefully selected for youth, physical prowess, family lineage, and proven fertility, provided the genetic material for the next generation. The goal was offspring quality, not emotional satisfaction. If an older nobleman's potency waned, if his sperm quality declined with age, a biological reality the Spartans seem to have understood empirically, even without modern genetics. But his wife remained fertile and in her reproductive prime, bringing in younger genetic stock improved the likelihood of healthy, strong sons who would become excellent soldiers. Plutarch presents this as yet another example of Spartan rationality overcoming emotional attachments. Jealousy was weakness. Personal pride about sexual exclusivity was self-indulgent individualism. The state needed soldiers. Producing the best possible soldiers required optimizing reproductive pairings. Personal feelings were irrelevant to demographic engineering. The practice was explicitly limited to elite families with resources, status, and social standing to manage the complexity. It wasn't widespread or practiced among common Spartans. This was an additional layer of optimization available only to the aristocracy, who had both the social security to experiment with unconventional arrangements and the genetic value worth preserving. The selection process for the younger man involved multiple considerations. He needed to be from appropriate family, not too distant in status from the older husband, because children's social position depended on publicly acknowledged paternity. He needed proven physical excellence, demonstrated through military training and performance. Ideally, he'd already fathered healthy children, proving his genetic worth. And he needed discretion. The arrangement required management to avoid gossip that might undermine the children's legitimacy. The woman had no recorded say in these arrangements. Ancient sources frame the practice as negotiation between two men, her husband and the selected progenitor. They negotiated about her body, her reproductive capacity, her sexual access, her womb as vessel for producing improved stock. She was the laboratory, the incubator, the means of production. Her consent wasn't sought because her will was irrelevant to the transaction. Think about her experience. She was married to an older man she might respect, but possibly didn't choose. Now he's arranging for another man to impregnate her. The arrangement is public enough that both families know, community members understand, and any children produced will grow up knowing their biological father isn't their legal father. She performs sexually with the selected man until pregnancy occurs, then the arrangement ends, and she returns to her husband. Some scholars question whether the practice was as common as Plutarch suggests, or whether he exaggerated to emphasize Spartan difference from other Greek cities. Plutarch wrote centuries after Sparta's classical peak, during the Roman period when Sparta had become a kind of theme park of its former self, maintaining traditions partly as tourist attraction. But Polybius, writing earlier and with different purposes, corroborates the basic practice, and the account specificity, details about selection criteria, legal arrangements, social management, suggests more than invention. Some version of approved non-exclusive mating for eugenic purposes existed among Spartan elite, though exact prevalence remains debated. The practice reveals the ultimate extension of Sparta's subordination of personal life to state military purposes. Marriage wasn't about love, companionship, or personal fulfillment. It was reproductive technology managed for genetic outcomes. Women were breeding stock, men were genetic donors or managers. Children were products whose quality mattered more than their parents' emotional bonds. The pattern continues, bodies managed for state purposes, reproduction divorced from relationship, women as means to eugenic ends determined by male authority. The oldest solution reappears in pharaonic Egypt. When lineage must remain pure, marry the daughter. Egyptian royal ideology sometimes framed the pharaoh's relationship with his daughter in marital or quasi-marital terms that disturb modern readers. Whether actual father-daughter unions occurred remains among Egyptology's most contentious debates. Certain inscriptions and titles suggest some New Kingdom pharaohs married their own daughters. The evidence is primarily linguistic and titular, daughters bearing titles like king's great wife while their father still lived, or inscriptions that can be interpreted as describing father-daughter unions. The most frequently cited case is Akhenaten and his daughter Ankhesenpaaten, later Ankhesenamun. Some scholars interpret certain Amarna period inscriptions as indicating a father-daughter marriage. Others vehemently dispute this, arguing the inscriptions reflect political titles or religious symbolism, not literal marriage. The theological framework existed for such unions. The pharaoh was divine, a living god. Gods in Egyptian mythology did marry close relatives, including daughters in some mythic cycles. If the pharaoh embodied divine nature, perhaps practices acceptable among gods became acceptable for him. But direct evidence is scarce. No marriage contract survives explicitly recording a father-daughter union. No tomb inscription unambiguously states X-pharaoh married his daughter Y. The arguments rest on circumstantial evidence, titles, iconography, and inferences from incomplete inscriptions. What is clear is that brother-sister marriage among Egyptian royalty was common and well documented, particularly in the Ptolemaic period. The question is whether the practice ever extended one generation further to father-daughter unions, or whether apparent evidence reflects misinterpretation of religious symbolism and political titles. The debate continues. Conservative scholars reject father-daughter unions as impossible even for Egyptians. More radical interpreters see the linguistic evidence as compelling. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Perhaps a few isolated cases, perhaps only religious rhetoric that modern readers mistake for literal practice. Either way, the ideology existed, bloodline purity taken to its extreme conclusion. When divine essence must not be diluted, the logic eventually points toward the unthinkable. When omens threatened the royal couple, Babylon had a solution that sounds impossible but is documented: swap the bride. Mesopotamian omen literature, particularly the astrological compendium Enuma Anu Enlil, predicted disasters based on celestial signs. When omens indicated danger to the king or his marriage, ritual specialists developed countermeasures. One of the strangest was the substitute king ritual, installing a temporary replacement king during dangerous periods so any predicted harm would befall the substitute instead of the true ruler. The substitute was usually a condemned criminal or expendable person. After the danger period passed, the substitute was killed, and the real king resumed power. Some scholars argue this substitution extended to marriage in certain circumstances. If omens specifically threatened the royal marriage or the queen, a substitute bride might be provided. A woman who would participate in certain rituals in the queen's place, absorbing predicted harm. The evidence is thin and highly debated. Ritual tablets describe substitute figures, riksu, used in various purification and protective ceremonies. Some texts mention substitute people, but clear references to substitute brides specifically are rare and ambiguous. What's clearer is that Babylonian royalty took omens seriously enough to develop elaborate avoidance rituals. If substitution worked for kings facing death omens, extension to marital contexts is theoretically possible, though documentation is limited. This represents marriage extended into magical thinking, the identity of the bride becoming mutable, replaceable with a stand-in who absorbed supernatural danger. The woman's personal identity mattered less than her ritual function. Whether widely practiced or rare, the concept reveals another dimension of ancient marriage's perversity. Not just legal and economic manipulation, but magical substitution, with women as interchangeable components in rituals protecting male power. And then came contracts that made pleasure the explicit point. Pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula, the same period that produced bequest marriage, also included another practice later forbidden by Islam: mut'ah, or temporary marriage for specified time periods. The custom allowed traveling merchants and warriors to enter time-limited marriage contracts, a week, a month, until the trade caravan departed. The contract specified duration and compensation. At the end of the period, the marriage dissolved automatically. Early Islamic sources discussing why certain verses were revealed describe mut'ah as Jahiliyyah custom. The Quran and Hadith, sayings attributed to Muhammad, address the practice, with Sunni tradition holding that Muhammad initially permitted, then later forbade it. Shia tradition maintains limited mut'a practice as permissible under specific circumstances, creating ongoing sectarian dispute. The custom served practical purposes for travelers who might be away from home for months. A temporary wife provided domestic services, companionship, and sexual access during the journey. The woman received payment, and any children born from the union had recognized paternity. But the practice's temporary nature transformed marriage from permanent bond into renewable contract. The woman knew the relationship was transactional and time-limited. This was marriage as prostitution with legal recognition, an exchange of sexual and domestic labor for compensation under temporary contract. For women, the practice offered income, but stigma. Temporary wives occupied ambiguous social status. Not quite prostitutes, not quite full wives. The certainty of abandonment was built into the contract. Islamic prohibition of mut'a in Sunni jurisprudence represented recognition that marriage requires permanence and commitment to function as family-building institution. Temporary marriage served male convenience while leaving women and any offspring vulnerable when the contract expired. Marriage, redesigned as a voucher with expiration date. Across continents and millennia, the pattern is stable, bodies controlled, bloodlines engineered, property channeled, purity policed, women commodified. Not one culture, not one century, many. The evidence spans from Mesopotamian clay tablets to Chinese tomb contracts, from Greek orations to Roman legal codes, from temple inscriptions in India to Viking sagas in Iceland. From 3000 BCE to the 20th century, the pattern persists with local variations, but universal logic. The costumes change: garlands in Greece, copal smoke in Mesoamerica, silk veils in China, blood-stained linen in medieval Europe, reed tallies in Babylon, sadi stones in Rajasthan, hack silver on Norse scales. The languages differ: cuneiform, hieroglyphics, Sanskrit, Latin, Old Norse, Classical Chinese. But the cuneiform and papyrus and carved stone all say the same thing in different tongues. Marriage was a system. Marriage was control. Marriage was power, made domestic and sanctified. Women auctioned by attractiveness, their value determined by community consensus, priced in silver and hack silver and trade goods. Virgins tested, their hymen subject to public inspection, their most intimate anatomy becoming courtroom evidence. Girls married as children before their bodies finished developing, their bloodlines calculated before they could speak for themselves, their reproductive capacity claimed by husbands and states and religious authorities. Widows inherited like furniture, passed from dead husband to living son, as if their personhood ended when their husbands did. Widows burned alive because society deemed them worthless without husbands, because supporting them was economically inconvenient, because their continued existence threatened property transmission. Widows relegated to social death, shaved heads, white clothing, restricted diet, exclusion, making actual death seem merciful by comparison. Sisters forced to brothers through ritualized kidnapping, their hair shorn, their femininity erased to ease their captors' psychological transition from military homosocial culture to heterosexual marriage. Daughters perhaps married to fathers, certainly married to uncles and cousins and brothers, divine bloodlines breeding themselves into genetic catastrophe to maintain theological purity and political power concentration. Brides kidnapped in ritual violence rebranded as tradition. Wives shared among brothers to prevent property division. Their sexual and emotional lives subordinated to real estate mathematics. Wives shared among strangers for eugenic purposes, their bodies becoming laboratories for demographic engineering. Wives married to corpses to satisfy cosmological requirements, their living years sacrificed to maintain celestial order and family hierarchy. Women pulled thorned ropes through their tongues in public ritual, bloodletting as proof of marriage's sacred worth. Pain transformed into piety. Women's virginity commodified and legally enforceable. Their wedding nights transformed into evidence collection procedures. Women's bodies inspected by priests and elders and designated examiners, their anatomy becoming matters of state interest and community surveillance. Some of these customs died. Medieval European bride inspections gradually faded as Enlightenment medicine revealed hymen variability and as notions of privacy strengthened. Sati was outlawed by British colonial authorities and later independent India, though enforcement remains imperfect. Babylonian bride auctions ended with Babylon itself, buried under centuries of sand until archaeologists excavated the tell and translated the tablets. Roman dowry manipulation evolved as legal systems changed, though elements persist in modern property law. Islamic reform abolished certain jahiliyyah practices, codifying prohibitions against practices like bequest marriage and widow inheritance. Chinese ghost marriages, while still occurring in isolated cases, face criminal prosecution rather than social acceptance. But some were outlawed, yet persisted secretly, driven underground but not eliminated. Ghost marriages in China continued into the 21st century in rural areas, occasionally surfacing in horrifying criminal cases involving corpse trafficking. Isolated sati cases still occur in India, despite comprehensive legal prohibition and criminal penalties. The 1987 Roop Kanwar case proved the custom retained enough cultural power to re-emerge. Close kin marriage continues in some communities worldwide, despite international medical consensus on genetic risks and human rights condemnation. Some echo faintly in modern expectations and legal leftovers, their logic surviving even as their most extreme forms disappeared. Dowries persist in modified forms across multiple cultures. Indian dowry deaths, where brides are killed when families can't meet escalating demands, claim thousands of women annually. Virginity obsession survives in purity culture movements that frame women's sexuality as commodity requiring protection and transaction through marriage. Marriage as property transfer still shapes inheritance law in most countries. Legal systems treat marriage as economic institution, creating property rights and obligations. Bloodline anxiety still drives DNA testing industries, genetic genealogy crazes, and paternity verification technologies that assume male property interests in offspring. Wedding traditions across cultures still include remnants of bride price, dowry, father, giving away daughter, rituals explicitly framing women as property transferred between men.